Olivia scrutinized her appearance in the large mirror hanging in the hallway. She smiled contentedly, deciding that she looked flawless. It wasn't like she was in a hurry for a date, but she'd woken up this morning with a sense of foreboding. She was going to learn something important today. Something that would probably change her life, help her realize her long-held dreams. Her expectations were quite earthly. She wanted to meet a fiancé in the city, someone both handsome and rich, to once and for all forget about all the worries about her beloved self. After all, she had an excellent commodity, maiden beauty. For such a lovely creature like her, she urgently needed a merchant who could stand on his own 2 feet. And was it too much to ask, begging fate not to be stingy? A car honked under the window. It was Iris's friend coming to pick her up. Olivia sighed heavily. She'd only been living in the regional center for a year, and she'd already had a generous sponsor and a lot of sweet love. Some people are lucky. Olivia had no better idea than to hit on pretty Iris. Now she was following her everywhere she went. She had the right kind of entourage. Except Olivia couldn't get a big fish in her net. Just a lot of little bastards with no capital and no opportunities. Olivia herself was from a distant village where she had finished high school and from where she had fled to the city. There were only 7 students in their graduating class. The village was considered unpromising. Only Olivia's mother didn't realize that. They came here one day to visit distant relatives. Well, they liked the beauty and nature of this welcoming place. Not to ruin themselves because of that, staying in an almost abandoned village forever. It's time to honor her by moving on in search of a better life. But Olivia's mother would not listen to anything about moving somewhere else. She kept trying to talk her daughter out of it. Olivia, where are we going to go, my dear? You and I have no one else in this world. And your father is buried here now. Where would I go from his grave? And you'll have something to do in the village. You go to your town to study. You'll come back as a school teacher or a paramedic. Our doctor should have retired a long time ago, but young people are not in a hurry to replace him. Olivia listened to her useless talk and was terribly angry. What teacher, what paramedic? Couldn't her mother see that Olivia had turned out like that? A well-built statue as if she'd been born in the countryside, but somewhere in the royal chambers at court. Medium height, graceful like some dancer on TV, with a mop of blonde hair and eyes like forget-me-nots, with an innate sense of taste and style. She studied fashion magazines in the backwoods with a struggle and excelled in the skill of needle and thread. While her mother sewed pillowcases out of old sheets, Olivia made glorious dresses and sundresses out of nothing. She learned to dye fabric and embroider. The local dressmaker Nancy lived in the neighborhood, and from her she picked up knowledge. It's a simple science, but not in a sundress skillfully sewn from material bought for curtains. Olivia wanted to step into her bright future. One day a friend of Nancy's came from the city to visit her. She laughed at the village dressmaker's old memory that everything in the city was the same, and she wanted individuality. When she saw Olivia, she was surprised to see such a beautiful girl in the middle of nowhere, and promised to bring a pile of clothes next time, which her daughter refused to wear, to pamper the lovely daughter of her friend's neighbor. She kept her promise. She brought a pile of things that were no longer fashionable, but so amazing for their village. She put a poisonous temptation in the soul of the inexperienced girl. Everyone praised how she wore jeans with rips on the knees, checked shirts, and a leather jacket with a rivet on the pocket. Almost new, but no longer fit, was a stylish suede waistcoat. The other was even cooler, made of some unknown shiny material that looked like snakeskin. Olivia was nearly out of her mind from all the luxury that had fallen on her head. She almost stopped sleeping at night. All saw herself in the city crowd, obviously unique, very, very beautiful. All the soul out of her mother said that she wanted to go to the city urgently, but not to study, but to find a job there, not dusty, suitable for such a charming young lady like her. Now at every opportunity she started talking to her mother about the fact that she, such a beauty, had no place in their village. It got to the point where Mrs. Linda, as her mother was called, couldn't sleep without taking 30 drops of sedative. She'd been so heartbroken since her husband died. Olivia was draining her soul with such an enviable persistence that she was about to go to her grave. Their fierce arguments were becoming more and more like a war. Mrs. Linda wondered, Did her daughter not understand that she was afraid to let her go alone to the big city at the age of 17? What kind of job without experience and profession? Where to live and with whom to socialize? The city is always full of dangers that can break Olivia's whole life. In order not to lead her daughter to sin, Mrs. Linda began to lock the house tightly, so that Olivia, for goodness sake, did not do anything while she was away. But it didn't work. Olivia escaped during the night, when her tired mother collapsed on the bed and fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, Mrs. Linda found a short note on the table. "Mom, I've gone to town. Don't look for me and don't try to bring me back if you want to keep any kind of relationship between us." Mrs. Linda dropped her hands helplessly on the table and spoke aloud to herself. "My God, Olivia is so stubborn, always doing things her own way and throwing herself at everything shiny. She chases after the tinsel. She doesn't see the important things in life. She's not a girl. She's nothing. Have mercy on her. It's good if she's taken the family stash from the box for the first time. I'm good. I never got the hang of this mobile phone stuff. There's a machine in a box with shiny buttons. My daughter can't call me here now. However, we have a connection only on the hill behind the outskirts is switched on, and the village is not really catching. Oh, bummer." That's how 17-year-old Olivia found herself alone in a noisy metropolis, where everyone was rushing about their business. In the pocket of her jeans is a note from Aunt Nancy, addressed to her mate, asking her to help Olivia at first. Looking ahead, it can be noted at once, the lover of outfits, created by the hands of the village dressmaker. Her friend did not let her down. Olivia even got some more things for her wardrobe from her daughter. She also helped her with renting a place to live. Her friend was just looking for a neighbor to rent a flat to pay half as much and take turns cleaning. So no special cataclysms with Olivia in the city did not happen. As her mother had expected, she had brought with her the home stash that Mrs. Linda had saved for the renovation of their cottage in the village. This small sum was enough to secure an early job as a dressmaker's assistant in an atelier. The family of Nancy's friend took the girl under her wing and cared for her in every possible way. The daughter of the hospitable woman was almost Olivia's age, and the quick-witted girl quickly brought Olivia into her youth circle. Olivia learned to call herself not just Olivia, but Special Olivia, alluding to her similarity to the muse of three prominent men, Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, and Paul Ehlert. Olivia had no idea who these men were, but she liked the idea very much. Now, when meeting men, she would flap her long, fluffy eyelashes and announce that her name was Olivia, adding, "Almost the one who was next to Dali." The names of the poet Paul Ehlert and the painter Max Ernst she pronounced with mistakes, so she used them carefully. Educated suitors more often than not only smiled slightly ironically when she introduced herself. How was Olivia to know that the one whose name she wanted to use was a bright, desperate, and ambiguous smartass? Far be it for Olivia's village prototype to match her heights. Other suitors took her nickname as a joke, Odd amuses the young lady, and so on. So far, Olivia had had no luck with suitable romances. Beauty, of course, is a strong weapon, but the girl did not want to develop intellectually. Men were happy to spend time with her, but they didn't want her in their midst. Olivia, who had already befriended Iris by then, complained constantly. "Tell me, what am I doing wrong? I've learned to look after myself. I dress fashionably. I have an easy disposition, and they all want to disappear with other women after a date in a hotel room. Is that what they're missing? Tell me." Iris herself was a daughter of the villagers, unlike many of the ladies they met in nightclubs. So she understood her friend's distress. Her boyfriend was not young. Iris he kept with him as a young, fresh trophy, but at the same time did not deny his girl anything. He bought a flat, an expensive foreign car, generously replenished the bank card, the money from which Iris spent at her discretion. The young woman carelessly laughed at him, called him my favorite piggy. Her man was indeed like a well-fed, aging pig. Olivia envied her as much as she could, but she didn't let on. She even tried to draw his attention to her. He nipped her in the bud. He hugged Iris defiantly, whispering softly in her ear. It was a good thing he didn't tell his mistress. It suited him that Iris was bored, that she had some sort of companion in Olivia. It even seemed to Olivia that he saw her as something like Iris's cute little pet dog. She's just a pet, but that's okay. And now Iris wanted to go to the town's famous fortune teller, since some time she began to think that the handsome Piggy had grown cold to her. The young-kept woman had to find out urgently whether her lover would take her to the registry office or would soon give her the go-ahead. Iris was used to living without denying herself anything, and the prospect of earning her own money didn't seem very bright to her. She dragged Olivia along for company. It was a bit scary to go alone. There were rumors about this mysterious fortune teller, that she was a harsh woman who looked into the eyes and saw the whole soul as in the palm of her hand, that she could not be deceived. Whatever she predicts will come true. Iris believed in all this nonsense, 50/50, but she decided to take a chance on luck. Olivia jumped out of the driveway and sat down on the seat next to the driver's seat. She started talking. "Iris, do you want to go to her first or should I go first? I don't really believe in this whole fortune-telling thing. Maybe she'll see what a septic she is and refuse to tell me anything." Iris drove the car with concentration, ignoring Olivia's chatter. She had a bad feeling that the fortune teller wasn't going to make her happy. Piggy had reproached her for the first time today for her immodest expenses in the salon, saying that she was good without all these procedures. He likes her just as she is. Iris painfully pondered whether to emphasize the fact that he had started counting her expenses or his words of love. They reached the fortune teller's house quickly, despite the traffic. Iris decided on the way that she couldn't wait long for the verdict. Better to go first. She was not. Olivia obediently stayed to guard the car in an unfamiliar courtyard. The fortune teller lived in an area that, although it was considered the center of the city, gave an eerie impression. Very old 2- and 3-story houses, metal buildings with rusty sides, maple trees, a few silver poplars, a lone skinny birch tree over a sandbox, shriveled old benches, once painted acid blue, now a faded color. Olivia looked round the place restlessly and thought, our village was neater than this. These witches like to make their own surroundings fit. Her thoughts were interrupted by a pleased Iris, who flew out of the driveway and straight to the parked car. She couldn't contain her overwhelming emotions. "Olivia," she said. "Ethan," she called her lover by his first name for the first time in front of her friend, "is marrying me because I'm going to get pregnant. We'll be together for over 20 years. God, how happy and calm I am now. And this woman knows from somewhere that I didn't come to her alone. She told me to make sure you come round. She has some important news for you." Olivia was stunned. What a twist. How could the prophetess have known that Olivia was waiting for her friend in the courtyard? Or was it Iris who had blurted it out? But female curiosity is a great engine for any adventure. Olivia shook her hair vigorously and set off to meet the news the fortune teller wanted to give her. The fortune teller's flat was on the first floor. Olivia walked up the long stairs and found herself at the ajar door. But when she hesitated at the entrance, she heard a hoarse voice. "Why are you so confused? It's not like running away from the village at night. Does it seem scarier?" I'm surprised the girl jumped on the spot and then immediately pulled herself together, stepped over the threshold. In the hallway, she saw an old wooden rack with carved decorations, heavy curtains of thick chocolate color with a golden border on the edges. The landlady impatiently hurried her once more. "How long have you been living in the city? Beautiful. Doesn't your conscience torment you that you have never once remembered your mother? I didn't go to see her. A strange woman brings her news about you. That's no good. No, it's not my business. Come in, sit down." Olivia obeyed the old woman's orders. She sat down on a high-backed chair. She began to calculate in her mind how long she had actually lived in the city. When she ran away from home, she was 17. Now she's about to turn 20. So she's been here over 2 years and her dreams never came true. Maybe this woman could give her a chance at happiness now. Olivia looked boldly into the fortune teller's inquisitive eyes, amazed at their green hue. The color would be clearer than emeralds, green as a light, the kind of eyes black cats have. Marvelous. Meanwhile, the professor moved the burning candle on the table. "See, while you're chilling here, your mother's going through treasures in her hands. A rich inheritance has fallen on her, unexpectedly and unexpectedly. She won't share it with you. She wants it all for herself. You can have it if you make the right decision. If you go down the wrong path, you spend your life alone. No one will really like your beauty, and you will wither in vain if your heart is covered with the same ice. Olivia found the fortune teller's speech a little too florid. Nothing concrete, just ramblings about inheritance and treasure. Her mother wouldn't have enough dresses to leave the house on a holiday. That's not much of a fortune. But the fortune teller decided to put an end to her story. Literally sealed Olivia to the chair with a description of shiny stones that could slip between her fingers, shine a bright comet of possibilities and disappear. Quickly gathering some divination paraphernalia on the table, the landlady silently pointed her finger at the door. She did not explain anything else. The young woman didn't feel like asking her anything. These predictions were rubbish. I'd better go and see my mate today. She had neglected this nice woman and her daughter with a man hunting, and she's no longer interested in the news the dressmaker brought from the village. What if there really was a big change there and she didn't know about it? We've got to fix this right away. It's time to pay a visit to her homeland. So as Mrs. Linda kneaded the dough for the scones on the table, she thought of Olivia. Her daughter was a tough nut to crack. It was as if she'd been at odds with her mother forever. Not a word from her, not a breath, not a message. Only scanty bits of information that she was alive and well, working in Italy or having fun in her spare time. Soon it's been 3 years since Olivia didn't cross the threshold of her native house. She cut off her mother like an unnecessary piece. Who was she born into? How many Mrs. Linda knew her family, all people worthy, all with difficult fates, but fighters for life? Take at least her aunt, to whom they came with her husband long ago, though a very distant relative, but she warmly sheltered them. She still lives in her house. Bright memory and eternal gratitude to her for this hospitable roof. The woman stacked the tortillas neatly. She put a large pot of compote on the cooker. Then she decided to dig potatoes for supper. She used to be the one who had to take care of the house. Now she had someone to take care of her. If only her heart didn't fail her, wouldn't respond with such hardhash to someone else's misfortune. Sometimes you see how another person is suffering. You'll think, and why do they always complain that there are a lot of problems and worries, that they became tired quickly, and in the morning they can hardly crawl out of bed? Fate sometimes throws up such twists and turns with young, beautiful and clever people, and nothing. They don't complain and don't cry. I peeled potatoes and decided to take more for breakfast this time. They'll fry the leftovers in a frying pan. They'll have a hearty meal that will give them strength for the whole day. Mrs. Linda smiled and thought for the 100th time how wonderful it was that she was not alone. And even though Ivan was the 7th water on the vine by blood, such a good boy, so well-mannered and pleasant, God himself sent him to make her grow old, not in empty orphanage walls, to have a dear soul near her. Moreover, the boy turned out to be so clever. He turned the whole village upside down, forced the village administration to buy some equipment according to his list. And now they live here, according to the modern principle of internet to every home. Where has that ever happened? She, Linda, had already learned how to approach the new computer. Click on the icon on the screen, call up the search engine. The bun she's about to bake will also be made from an internet recipe. Her nephew is an innovator. Linda's thoughts were interrupted by a noise in the yard. Dogs barking. And Ivan's pet Joe threw a shaggy ball at her feet. Now what's all this commotion, thought the woman, and she was stunned. Outside the window stood Olivia. In person. What a surprise. Linda's thoughts raced through her mind like a herd of horses. How to behave now with her daughter, to reprimand her from the doorstep, or to pretend that nothing was going on, that there were not several years of separation and mutual silence. A mother's love prevailed. Mrs. Linda met Olivia cordially, hiding all the old grudges in a long box. After all, according to popular wisdom, young chicks should always be let out of the nest. Maybe what happened was her fault. She didn't want to listen to her daughter's arguments, so she paid for it. We hugged. Mrs. Linda pulled her daughter away from her. She looked at her intently. Olivia looked even better, more like a city girl in stylish clothes and fancy makeup. Even Mrs. Linda, unassuming in such things, could see it at first sight. And Olivia kept petting her, telling her how much she missed her, how much she'd missed her mother all this time. How could Mrs. Linda know that her daughter was preparing the ground to find out about the mythical inheritance and try to take it away from her mother for herself? Why would an aging woman want treasure if it really existed? Olivia's mother-daughter game was interrupted by a rustle in the next room. She wasn't even surprised when a strange guy peeked into the kitchen where she and Mrs. Linda had been chatting and disappeared out of sight. What a mystery. Olivia hurried to find out who it could be. "Mom, do you have someone living in the house now?" Mrs. Linda's face lit up with a worn smile. "That's Ivan, my nephew and yours. Cousin. He's 17 years old. We live with him now. He's a great handyman and very talented." Olivia was more surprised than ever. Olivia began to urge her mother to tell her all about her new relative. Mrs. Linda became visibly sad. "There are no special secrets in Ivan's fate. There is only trouble and trouble. This is his grandfather and grandmother's house. You and I are having tea in the kitchen right now." Ivan's parents were geoscientists. They were engaged in the discovery of diamond deposits in Yakutia, or rather, in assessing the contents of kimberlite pipes, where future diamonds are usually found. They worked in the harsh land almost all their lives. Ivan was born there too, in one of the villages near the Velikaya River. Olivia's got her ears perked up. Yakutia, diamonds. How promising did it all sound? She turned her ears to listen, afraid to miss a word. And her mother continued. Ivan's parents later moved to the town of Murni, near where the largest diamond mine in the world is located. The boy suffered a spinal injury at birth. A complicated one, but it turned out much later, not immediately. He has a rare physiological abnormality. Ivan has a special kind of weakness in his spinal muscles. He can't stay in one position for a long time, and the only thing that saves him is a special orthopedic narrow corset, which has to be reordered in Germany every year. Olivia listened to her mother with bated breath. They didn't need another invalid in the house. Where were his parents? Why was her mother in charge of the boy? As if anticipating all these questions, Mrs. Linda continued. Ivan's father died 2 years ago back in Yakutia, and 4 months ago his mother passed away here in my arms. The long and harsh strain on the body took its toll. They, like you and me, have practically no other relatives. So Ivan brought me here so I could help him as much as I could. Their wages at work varied. Sometimes in pebbles, bonuses for a future life of security. What's more, there was this amazing story in Ivan's parents' life. A long time ago, at the very beginning of the business, when diamonds were just beginning to be mined in a serious industrial way. So they were working near the same river. And kimberlite rods were found there that were necessary and important for the state. And it was decided to demolish the Yakut village nearby in order to dig a bigger and deeper quarry. All the thresholds of district committees and regional committees were beaten. Then Ivan's parents suggested a sensible scheme of the quarry, and they did not ask anyone, nor persuaded anyone, but the village survived. And one evening an elderly Yakut knocked on their hut, brought a present, said that from every yard. "We collected a pebble for you, kind people. Don't be sorry, what we could." That's how it is. Over the years of working in Yakutia, Ivan's parents had collected a rather weighty bag of diamonds, and brought me a gift from Germany to look after Ivan. She was able to pay for new Czech orthopedic tapes. This house needs to be fixed up. For so many years it has served us faithfully, patiently waiting for repairs, giving us a roof over our heads. Mrs. Linda suddenly revived. Olivia never asked you for anything for herself. To give me your word that if anything happens to me, you will not leave Ivan. After this confession, Olivia was completely bewildered. Yes, her mother was out of her mind, keeping diamonds to buy Ivan medical equipment or to renovate an old shack. We got to get those stones out of her. Iris knew a jeweler in town. He'd know how much he could get for them. The Yakuts must have collected some of the best things in gratitude, and the bonus for the work must be substantial too. Mom, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. What kind of a nurse am I to an invalid? Live in peace, but the diamonds, you'd better give them to me for safekeeping. Keep a couple of pebbles and that'll be enough for you and Ivan for a while. You're still working a bit. I bet he's got a disability pension. Mrs. Linda's face was petrified at her daughter's words. Her heart felt as if pierced by a needle. She realized at once that Olivia's interest in her as a mother was ostentatious. She had come to find out what her mother was doing with her life, to see if there was anything she could get her hands on. Her mood had plummeted. It's a pity it's nighttime, or I'd have kicked her out by now. We'll have to wait till morning. Mrs. Linda quickly cleared the table, wiped it with a damp cloth. Turning to her daughter, she said, You and I will not agree, Olivia, on the fate of the pebbles and their proper use. That's where we disagree. Now it's too late, and tomorrow morning go from here back to the city. I never thought I'd raise my daughter to be so callous." We went to bed in silence. Mrs. Linda was thinking about her own thoughts. Mrs. Linda about how Olivia had turned out to be an indifferent, callous doll. Olivia was plotting how to get the diamonds, but nothing good had come to mind yet. In the morning, Olivia had breakfast on the table. She had come to her father's house after all, but she didn't touch it. She left without looking back. She didn't raise an eyebrow, noticing the mute question in her mother's eyes. Had her daughter come to her senses? Had she realized her mistakes? But Olivia only gave her an icy stare in response. And when she arrived in the city, she couldn't find a place for herself, working out a strategy, choosing tactics. It seemed the best way was to steal it quietly and get away. Her mother would not believe her if she told her a pathetic story about her invented misfortunes. But how would she cover her tracks? Her mother would guess at once whose handiwork the theft was. It would be good to play that all was done by strangers, unexpected robbers. After thinking about the best way to get closer to the house, Olivia decided to organize a staged break-in from the outside on the weekend. Why delay? She had prepared some old, comfortable jeans and a tight jumper to make it easier to get through the window. Since she'd left home, Mrs. Linda had made it a habit to sleep with the windows open. That would help Olivia. She arrived in the village early. Knowing the layout of the house, she assumed that her mother was unlikely to keep the precious stones in her rooms or kitchen. Most likely she hid them in a secluded corner of the cellar. It's safer that way. The weather favored her plans. The full moon, which had recently been shining brightly, had disappeared behind the clouds. But the rain didn't seem to be falling. Only the breeze was fresh. Olivia's heated face, already glad that the kitchen window near the cellar stairs was open, felt cool. The dashing burglar waited until all the windows in the house were out. Then she sat in the bushes for another half hour to make sure that the occupants were asleep. Olivia was still acting cautiously today. Even the local dogs were gone, not responding to her movements with barking. Max, her so-called relative's pet, was also silent. The last time she'd visited, that pesky dog had been in her face, and she couldn't stand that kind of calf tenderness. Olivia made her way down to the cellar without any disturbance. Everyone in the house was sleeping peacefully. Only the little dog was still around. He blinked his beady eyes at the light of the torch, as if in judgment. Olivia whispered to him in annoyance. "What are you looking at, Shaggy? I can do what I want in my own house." But Ivan's dog didn't agree with her. Restless, she scurried around the cellar doorway, where Olivia was fumbling with the shelves, and she was lucky enough to find an unfamiliar pouch with what looked like small glass beads rolling around in it. She knew at once that it was exactly what she needed. Neither conscience nor remorse tormented her. To make sure she had the diamonds in her hands, Olivia held the torch up close to them. They were nothing like her usual idea of diamonds. Even in the near darkness, it was obvious that the pebbles had barely discernible shades in color, and overall looked like tiny, slightly frosted shards of glass or ice. When the beam from the torch hit them, they seemed to shudder and sigh slightly, becoming alive and mysterious. Olivia admired her find and began to climb upstairs, away from the cellar. "Get out of the house." At that moment, her torch went out. All around at once there was darkness, a kind of restless, eerie darkness. Only upstairs in the basement were the eyes of Max, silent today. Olivia jerked helplessly, an unpleasant feeling of animal fear settling in her chest. But then she remembered that there was a box of votive candles on the shelf next to her, and a few packs of matches. She also thought that they were no good in a humid room. She chose a thicker candle from the bundle and struck a match. The cellar glowed with an uneven but acceptable light. And then the unexpected happened. Max barked loudly, his canine voice full-blown. Olivia, frightened, dropped the flaming candle onto the pile of dry straw with which Mrs. Linda was covering the winter vegetables. The flame flared instantly. Olivia rushed to the cellar exit and began to calm the dog. "Shut up. Why are you barking? You seem like a reasonable dog, but you're so loud." She reached for the rope tied to the cellar door, but ineptly. Instead of helping her out, the sneaky wicker snake slammed the door it was tied to in her face. Olivia struggled to keep the pouch in her hands, then slipped it into her pocket. It was the last thing she remembered clearly. The acrid smoke made it hard to breathe. She first felt a sharp sickness and then passed out. When Mrs. Linda woke up, she knew something was wrong. She wanted to rush into Olivia's room, but her heart was pounding too hard, and there was a sharp pain behind her sternum. I moved to the kitchen, where the dog was still howling. I was horrified to see smoke billowing from under the cellar door. She had not learnt that her daughter was lying there without feelings. She decided to rush into the yard to call the neighbors for help. She still had time to scream wildly. Fire. Help. And then she collapsed against the low fence. Her heart stopped, unable to bear the misfortune that had come to the house. Heaven had made sure that she would not know of Olivia's betrayal, but it spared her in this cruel way, taking her life in return. Max dashed from the kitchen to the master suite. Ivan was always a very sound sleeper and didn't know there was a fire in the house. Not yet, he didn't know. By some miracle, despite his small size, the dog had pulled the blanket off him and had been howling and whimpering at him while the boy tried to get up. Ivan realized at once that there was something wrong in the house and rushed into the kitchen, where the smoke had already filled the house. When he opened the cellar door, thinking it was Mrs. Linda doing something in it in the middle of the night. He could see nothing downstairs, but he thought he heard a sound. He tumbled down the steps, and he cursed himself for not having time to put on his orthopedic corset, which remained on the chair beside his bed. In the cellar, he had an unpleasant discovery. There was nothing to see, so he decided to try to pour water on the fire from a bucket in the corner. On the way to it, he tripped over Olivia, who was lying on the floor, and fell, not realizing anything. Only then did Ivan realize it was Mrs. Linda's daughter, not herself. He wondered what she was doing in the cellar at night. Apparently he'd slept through the whole thing, hadn't heard her arrive. So without thinking long, Eben began bracing the young woman. She didn't respond. Then, with difficulty, hoisted her onto his shoulder and dragged her to the stairs. He shouldn't be lifting, much less carrying heavy things. His legs immediately began to shake. His spine responded treacherously to his efforts with intense pain. His hands clenched. The cellar had never seemed such a large space to him, but now every step was a struggle. He shifted Olivia onto her arms, which almost didn't want to obey. When he reached the steps, he pushed her up ahead of him, centimeter by centimeter. The burden grew heavier and heavier. The load was unbearable, and the fire was already coming up behind him, which, because of the high humidity in the cellar, was not blazing, but burning in islands. Someone's voices were already heard in the house. Max barked exhaustedly somewhere nearby. His back was getting hotter and hotter, but he didn't let Olivia out of his clenched fingers, and he wasn't used to surrendering to circumstances. He wasn't used to giving in. When he finally put Olivia in someone else's arms, he fell backwards. In a second, the ravenous flames had already reached his face. His back was tearing with pain. He passed out. In the yard, they tried to revive Mrs. Linda. The neighbors were still hoping that she had just fainted, that an ambulance would come and everything would be all right. After a while, Olivia and then Ivan were placed on the ground next to Mrs. Linda. The ambulance that arrived soon after didn't know who to grab. There was only a medical center in their remote village, and it had taken an inexcusably long time to get from the district hospital. Chaos, panic, general commotion. It's a good thing the cellar fire was dealt with quickly. The house above it was barely damaged. Only Ivan was badly hurt, burned face, back, arms, legs that refused to serve. When the doctors brought him to his senses, he whispered, "My corset, I can't move without it," and he fell back into oblivion. Mrs. Linda had already been put on a stretcher and covered with a white sheet. Ivan did not see it all. Olivia, who had already been brought to her senses, looked at her mother's body with a kind of detached expression. The thoughts in her head were lingering, alien. All this horror is not happening to me. I'm asleep and I'm having a terrible dream. I'm going to wake up and everything will be the same. I've done nothing wrong. But Providence was silent, stubbornly unresponsive to Olivia's questions, giving no signs. Nothing, it seemed, could distract her from her cherished goal, to become rich and then happy. It was the heavy bag that prevented Olivia from dreaming that all events could be reversed. She smiled predatorily and jumped to her feet. "It's my mother's fault, and Ivan's. You should be sharing your wealth with your own, not hiding it from her alone. You fight for what you fight for, you get what you get. and this crazy bloke's trying to save her. I'd have to call the hospital later, check on his health. Olivia emptied her wallet of all the cash she had. Luckily, she'd never spent that much in a night. She carried everything she earned with her. It had been payday the day before. People in the village were modest and used to everything. She would cope with her mother's funeral, and then she would come on the day of the funeral. There were two important, urgent matters waiting for her in town. She'd have to sort out the jewelry, find out what it was worth on the market. Mrs. Linda was buried by the whole village. Here they loved kind-hearted people, and were ready to see them off with all their hearts. Olivia traveled to her mother's funeral with Iris in her car. She didn't dare bring her other party friends to the countryside. They'd make fun of her. Why would she want that kind of fame? All the way there, Iris chattered on and on about her new collection of handbags, lamenting that her boyfriend hadn't given her enough money for the most expensive one. Olivia didn't care much about the subject this time. She just smiled politely and kept thinking about her mother. Oh, was she really gone? Was she alone in the world now? It's not familiar. What should I do with the house now? Let it stand if it doesn't need maintenance. Ivan's supposed to be 18 soon. Let him live, keep the house. I've got to make time to visit him at the hospital. At the burial ceremony, Olivia stared at her mother, thinking, not feeling any guilt. That woman in the coffin didn't look anything like her. That's it. I don't have to come here anymore. Iris introduced Olivia to a jeweler she knew. He was willing to buy one of the stones from her. But it didn't seem worth that much. Olivia had expected more, but she thought the jeweler was dishonest. He didn't seem particularly interested in her jewelry, but at the end he insistently advised her that next time she should only come to him again. Olivia got the impression that he had deceived her because of her inexperience in this business. But as a professional, he wasn't the only one. She'd look for someone else when she'd sorted out her mother's funeral. No need to complain. The money she'll get will be enough to keep her out of the atelier for a couple of years. That's not a bad thing. After the cemetery, Olivia didn't feel like attending the wake. What would she talk to all those people about? There was nothing to connect them now. She slipped a thin wad of money into Nancy's hands. Aunt Nancy, would you mind looking after Mum's grave? It's too far and inconvenient for me to come here, she said. The dressmaker nodded in agreement. She wanted to ask Olivia about Ivan's future fate, but she nervously got into her friend's car, and they drove off. Nancy sighed sorrowfully, thinking, the city life spoils people, takes away their living heart, and gives them a heart of stone and ice instead. Not everyone can remain their real selves. That same evening, after she'd barely made it into town, Olivia decided to honor her mother in her own way. She dragged Iris to the bar where all the women gathered. She walked from table to table with a glass of wine. Her so-called friends didn't even hide their boredom at Olivia's suggestion that they honor her mother's memory, and she remembered her home village, where her neighbors' faces were full of sincere sadness, where everyone tried to hug her, to support her, to say kind words. After another glass, a bitter thought crept into her soul. She was all alone now. Nobody really cared about her. If she didn't come here for a couple of weeks, everyone would forget about her existence. Sitting down in the far corner, Olivia grinned as she listened to the women talking. What were they talking about? About lovers annoying as hell, but generous enough to put up with them. About children who better be given to a nanny or they'd be a pain in the arse. Olivia thought of Ivan, and she was so sad that she ran out of the bar and into the night. When she hailed a taxi, she promised the driver triple the meter if he would take her immediately to the district hospital, where the boy had been admitted after the fire. The surprised taxi driver kept silent the whole way, not asking any unnecessary questions. It was dawn when they reached the place, and Olivia began to knock impatiently on the doors of the hospital. She realized that she didn't even know Ivan's surname, but money could solve more problems than that. 10 minutes later, the doctor on duty was already telling her Ivan's story. The patient came to us in a serious condition, severe burns, paralysis of the lower limbs. At the local hospital, of course, we provide all the necessary therapy, but our capabilities are limited. Ivan has no close relatives. No one will fight for his health. In fact, he's doomed to live in some state-run orphanage for lonely wretches like him. There's no other way to live. Our hospital doesn't have the resources to do anything about his burn lesions on his skin. There'd be horrible scars everywhere. and it's not realistic for us to get him back on his feet." Olivia interrupted the doctor halfway through. "Yvonne is my brother, and I want to see him right away." The doctor talking to her only shrugged his shoulders. "It's good that he's got someone. Put on a medical gown and I'll show you to his room." The morning twilight, just before the sun comes out. It's a bit squalid with 4 beds with patients still sleeping in them. Yvonne's bed is by the window. Olivia sits down on the edge of it and begins to look at her brother. He's a good-looking guy, despite his thin build and spinal condition. He seems wiry and strong, covered in bandages. Only one eye is not hidden by the bandage. He suddenly opens it. Although Olivia cannot see his lips, she can feel that he is smiling. Barely audible, Olivia whispers, "You're all right then. I couldn't get anyone to tell me what's wrong with you or how. There's nothing worse than the unknown." Yvonne looked around the room guiltily. "And I'm worried about you. I know Mrs. Linda's gone. I wondered if you were alone, if you were all right." Olivia couldn't believe her ears. She thought of the bar, of her friend's idle, worthless conversation about nothing. They'd put up with her before, because she was Iris's close mate. And what's on the way out? Just coldness and indifference. And here she had a brother she didn't even know she cared about for nothing, not for any favors. Olivia stood up abruptly and went to find one of the doctors so she could ask them the question she was worried about. She would take Yvonne into town, put him in another, more modern and better equipped clinic. A single thought filled the mature woman's mind. Why do I need all these diamonds if I'm going to be, as I am now, alone in this world? I'll spend it on his treatment. I'll do everything I can. And then we'll live together in our house in the village. I'll be his rock. He followed me into that terrible fire. It's a common belief that people don't change. A self-serving girl like Olivia can't give up her dreams of wealth and luxury overnight. It may not be a change of heart for everyone, but Olivia was completely sincere in her impulses. It was her heart and soul that asked her to help Yvonne, no matter how fabulously implausible it might sound. And it wasn't money, really, that she'd been looking for when she'd gone to town. She wanted more love, attention, and care from a man. Just like that, not in exchange for her beauty. She'd realized this not so long ago, when she'd heard another gentleman say that he was inviting someone other than Olivia on holiday. The city's high society was deceitful to the core, shiny on the outside, rotten on the inside. After getting the hospital on its ear, Olivia had arranged everything. Ivan would be referred to the city's burn center and transported for an additional fee. There would be no delay. While the discharge papers were being prepared, she drove to her mother's cemetery. As she stood by the grave, as if looking for her approval of her decision, there was dead silence all around. Only the leaves rustled in the trees and the lilac bush sagged in the breeze. Olivia suddenly thought of the dog. Where could Yvonne's favorite dog have gone? Maybe one of the neighbors had taken him in. The same neighboring dressmaker had found the dog. "Will you take this misfortune to your place?" She smiled. "He has a way of howling at night. He's useless. The children don't like him. He's too bad, too unkind. He's only caused me trouble. You can't throw a living thing out on the street." Olivia picked up the dog, then collected some of Ivan's personal belongings from the house, which the ambulance had taken out in a hurry. It wasn't right for a guy to be without some personal wardrobe. You can't go back to town in hospital pajamas. On the way to the clinic, they had to suffer. Ivan couldn't wear his orthopedic brace, so bad was his back. Special transport was only promised in 3 days. Demand was high, so they had to put Ivan in the back seat of the car and Olivia in the driver's seat in the front. But that was half the problem. The mood was lifted by the dog, who squealed at the sight of his beloved master. They all thought that his tail would be torn off from happiness, so he wagged it. Ivan was quickly admitted to the hospital. In a fee-for-service hospital, patients are measured by how much they pay for services. Olivia paid for a fortnight's stay in good faith. The boy was immediately assigned a personal nurse and a carer. Olivia went home to recover and reflect. She lounged in the bathtub with fragrant foam for a long time and admired herself in the mirror in the hallway. It was a strange thing. For the first time, she didn't consider her beauty a commodity. She didn't bother with her appearance, didn't think about her upcoming date, the party, hanging out with the girls. None of that bothered her now. She waited to see what the doctors would tell her after Ivan's full examination. She was going to take it from there. First, she went to the crafty jeweler again and gave him 2 more diamonds. There was no time to look for another buyer, but Olivia was not upset by the fact that she could get more money for the stones. Her brother's health was at stake. It didn't take long for the doctors to give their verdict on Ivan. Olivia was only a little confused at first by the intricate terms, but she grasped the key point of the doctor's report. Ivan would not be able to become a skin donor for himself, and he needed to graft flaps on his face and back. Otherwise, he'll never wear a corset again. In his case, only transplantation of another person's tissues can remedy the situation. The doctor explained everything. You need to find someone who can donate fragments of his skin for Ivan. The wounds are still fresh, but it's not just days, it's hours. Further delay in surgery increases the risk of irreversible complications for the boy. The skin for the face will have to come from someone's neck. Otherwise, Ivan's face will permanently lose the ability to make any facial expressions. For the back, it's a little easier. Olivia wasn't listening as attentively as she'd been listening to him, and she stopped him with a gesture. How much donor skin can I give to help Ivan completely? The astonished doctor hesitated. Do you realize that no amount of plastic surgery will bring back the beauty of your body? Olivia smiled calmly. I didn't hear an answer to my question. How much of this, what's his name? Graft can I give my brother? The doctor coughed. He looked at her carefully. I've been working here for almost 10 years. I've never met such a beautiful volunteer donor. I can't answer your question right away. You'll have to come in for a full workup too. Olivia sat on a bench in the courtyard of the clinic, where Ivan was lying, looking at the graffiti on the walls, bright, colored. To some of the graffiti had inscriptions next to them. A picture of an angel and a devil in the eternal confrontation between good and evil caught her attention. Above them, a quote from Dante's Divine Comedy was clearly carved. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Olivia didn't know much about literature. She didn't know where the phrase came from. But it was at that moment that she finally made up her mind. I'll leave Ivan with the hope that everything will be all right. After all, beauty isn't the most important thing in the world. Ivan was terribly upset. He was about to undergo a series of surgeries, and Olivia had suddenly disappeared. Instead, some friendly auntie came to see him. She brought fruit, sweet, strong broth, and huge chunks of boiled chicken. But Olivia was gone, and he longed for her. Surgery during treatment didn't scare him. He couldn't walk after the fire. He knew that if the outcome was favorable, he would be able to restore the motor functions of his legs only after wearing a corset. And for that, he needed to heal his burnt back from the wounds. She was weird. It was his sister Olivia who had been scornful of Mrs. Linda for not wanting to deal with an invalid, who had fallen like a thunderclap into the cellar during the fire, who had dragged him to light him to lake where she was dusting him off, who had disappeared in an unknown direction. So he didn't know what to think anymore. Ivan took an orange slice from the saucer and grinned. Why did he and all the patients have to bring oranges here? And what was so special about them? Maybe the bright orange color was pleasing to the eye, the pleasant citrus aromas and the sweet taste. He sighed heavily again. The attempt to turn his thoughts from thinking about Olivia to oranges had failed miserably. So all he could think about was her again. The constant questioning of his doctor's sister had encouraged him to do so. Who was she? Where did she get the money for this clinic? Does she have a husband or a friend? Ivan knew nothing about the existence of the inheritance, a decision of his parents, which became a heavy burden. It was a fact his parents had once kept silent about. Mrs. Linda had told him nothing, and she had withheld everything about her adventures with the sack and Olivia. Ivan had long wondered where Olivia got the money to pay for his care and treatment at the clinic, but he didn't dare ask it directly. Soberly, he thought they could still discuss it later. In the operating room, nurse came into the room. Well, Ivan, we're all set. I'm right behind you. Don't be afraid of anything. Donor skin grafting isn't the most complicated operation. You'll be as fresh and new as a cucumber after you've been patched up here. Let's go, sweetheart. We're going to get you on a gurney, and we're going to get you on your way. Mr. Dan Wilson, a burn surgeon at No. 2 Private Hospital. kept delaying and delaying the start of the operation. He kept thinking that now this beautiful young woman would change her mind about giving her skin to her brother, would attack him, Dan, with accusations. "How dare you, and you misunderstood me." But his patient was already waiting for him in the operating theater. She smiled cheerfully at him, added words that shocked him. "I'm happy to be able to do this. Let's get started." Dan looked round the instrument table and got to work. There was definitely no turning back now. They had come to Israel for the 3rd year in a row. For a long time they lived in one of the boarding houses near the Dead Sea. Ivan was undergoing another course of treatment. Already slowly he began to walk with a stick. Grown up, mature, handsome, a real beauty with a cane, or a lone rebel. They usually went to the hot country in October. The diamond stockpile had dwindled considerably. Olivia never found another jeweler. Time and time again, she let the old bugger cheat her. She didn't care as long as the money came in faster. She didn't care about the rest. She'd first appeared in Ivan's room more than 3 years ago, when he'd given up all hope. Auntie Nurse was there for him all the time, with her healing broth. But she wasn't Olivia. He thought his sister had left him for good, miserable and frightened. The trouble with his brother was for strangers. The first time they met after a long separation, he even noticed at once that a very different woman had come to see him. She wore a black jumper with a blue pattern around the throat, light-colored trousers, trainers instead of the usual stiletto shoes. Olivia looked both sterner and clearer. She threw herself around his neck, but when he hugged her, she suddenly wrinkled her nose painfully, but immediately calmed him down. "I was a little ill, Ivan. That's why I was away so long." Of course, Ivan didn't know that Olivia was still regenerating tissue after a series of surgeries, that she'd stubbornly stayed the course when they told her they'd look for another donor, her resources already fully utilized. And he learnt about his sister being a donor for him. He learnt about the transplant much later. Mr. Dan Wilson had unwittingly let it slip when he told Ivan that he and Olivia were together. Nor did Ivan know anything about the fact that between his operations, Olivia lived in the village alone with her dog, who finally recognized her as her rightful owner. She had spent her money, by the standards of a lady of her formerly high society, inappropriately and needlessly. She erected an expensive monument to her mother in the cemetery. She kept going to her with bouquets of roses, trying to beg forgiveness for her foolishness and empty dreams. Mr. Dan Wilson began to visit Olivia's village at weekends on the pretext of visiting his special patient. One night he confessed that he had loved her ever since she had told him that beauty was nothing if it couldn't save a loved one. He was much older than Olivia, divorced, and living apart from his 2 children from his first marriage, who were now being raised by his stepfather. He'd also long ago stopped believing in the sincerity of women. With Olivia, it was different. Olivia herself with Mr. Dan Wilson felt a very pleasant sense of serene calm. At last the man wasn't embarrassed or alienated by her after a pleasant time. When she got out into the city, they would buy building materials together to renovate the house. In the village they went to nice cafes, where they ordered not fancy sushi and rolls, but borscht and cutlets. They talked for a long time, made plans for the future, strolled aimlessly through parks, went to cinemas to watch some new movie, and then hotly discussed it. Then we would hurry home again and fall asleep in each other's arms, and all this was somehow quiet, but very tender and touching. As fate would have it, one night when Mr. Dan Wilson was visiting Olivia, one of the neighbors in Nell became ill. But it's hard to make a mystery out of something in the countryside. Everyone knew that Olivia's city suitor was a doctor, so there was no question of knocking on their window. The local paramedic was away with the kids for the weekend. There was no one to help the sick man, and Mr. Dan Wilson was certainly up to the task. In the morning, the neighbor's wife recovered and was already standing on the doorstep with a stack of hot pancakes. She shifted shyly from foot to foot and said, "Don't be sorry, my family. I brought what I could, what God sent us. Oh, Mr. Dan Wilson, how wonderful it would be if you could take over from our paramedic. He's old, he hasn't been able to cope with us all for a long time. Come and stay with us for good. Our air is clean and our people are sincere and kind. You'll be fine here, and Olivia will always be with you," she continued. Mr. Dan Wilson listened earnestly and promised to think about it. He himself had long ago realized that he wanted a different relationship with his unwilling patient, a definitive one, with the stamp and the passport, A full family with children. But so far he hadn't dared to propose to Olivia. She was all wrapped up in her own problems. This was a topic that needed to be put to rest. Olivia was still thinking that she was no longer drawn to the bustling metropolis, with its bright lights and ostentatious soulfulness. The spiritual nature of people did not depend on where they lived. But in the village, it was easier and calmer for her now. All her old dreams had disappeared. Her desires had changed. Her circle of interests was narrow but warm. Ivan, Mr. Dan Wilson. After bathing in the Dead Sea, even went each time to the shower set up on the shore opposite the reservoir. Right now, he was washing off the excess Dead Sea minerals that coated his skin profusely. The burn marks on his body could now only be seen if he looked closely. After Ivan's therapeutic bath and shower, he and Olivia hurried to the open-air cafe. The staff knew them by sight as regular customers. They had coffee for Olivia and tea for Ivan. Before they sat down, Yvonne carefully covered her shoulders with a dry terry towel, looked into her eyes, and once again asked the question that had been on his mind. "When are you going to take care of yourself?" "I'm almost completely fine. The renovations on the house are done. You and Mr. Dan Wilson are married, and he's moved into the village. What else is there to look forward to? Why are you holding off on the neck job until now?" Olivia smiled warmly at him. "Well, my Yvonne, how thoughtful you are. It's not time yet. The scars remind me of my past mistakes and misconceptions. I feel like I haven't paid off all my old debts yet." Chugging each other, brother and sister hurried to the boarding house for dinner. Both knew that they were near together. Both were grateful to fate for that. Sometimes Olivia thought there was some hidden meaning in that cellar fire. The universe had shown her that she was not to be trifled with, and that guilt would always be punished. And Olivia was a bright student. Now Mrs. Linda wouldn't tell her daughter she had a heart of stone and ice. Beauty doesn't last forever. Love is all-powerful. Olivia knew that for sure now. A father sets up a camera to save his fading daughter, and after barely a glance at the tape, Jane decided at an early age that girls were either beautiful or smart. The girl knew full well she could choose, and she chose to be smart. In front of her eyes was the example of her older sister Ellen. Everyone around admired her beauty. I mean, come on, light blonde hair, silky green mermaid eyes. A figure they call such a model. Helene, from an early age, was focused only on her appearance. She read a lot, but it was fashion magazines with advice on makeup, diets, and so on. And Kate's girlfriends were exactly the same. Jane thought they were pretty, frivolous fools. A mother raising 2 daughters alone had high hopes for her eldest. "When you marry well, Ellen, we'll have a good life," she used to say. Jane was still a very young girl, studying in the 4th or 5th grade. The girl was frankly perplexed. How could one put the responsibility for her happiness and well-being on some other person? Did her mother, who had been burned herself, not draw the right conclusions? Once Jane asked her mother directly, "You married your father for his money too, and he left us, went to a younger and prettier, and left nothing for you or the children, because she had a good appetite. And now you're telling Ellen to do the same thing, so she'll do the same." Blaspheme on your tongue. Mum shook her hands. Helene is different. Firstly, she's young, and secondly, she's much prettier than me. And anyway, she has me. I'm the one who had to figure it out. And I'll help her, and I'll teach her everything. You'll be fine, and so will you, if you listen to me. Jane just sighed heavily. Her mother was beautiful and kind, but she was too easygoing. Both her mother and Ellen lived with rose-colored glasses on their eyes. Everyone dreamed of a beautiful life, believed that looks were the determining factor in a woman's success. But it wasn't so for everyone. Jane differed from her peers' warehouse of character, has always been pragmatic, responsible, far-sighted. And she clearly understood that, in order to achieve something in this life, you need to work hard. And the options that have in mind mother and older sister, rich men, benefactors, it's all unreliable, fragile, illusory. Ellen jokingly called her little sister a bore. Her mother was always trying to remake Jane, to impose her point of view on her daughter. The most interesting thing is that the parent sincerely believed that she wished her child well. She said, "I'm worried about your future. How can you not understand? You are a beauty. We got such a one. You got the best from me and your father. When you finish school, we'll find you a wealthy fiancé. Don't be such a bore. Men like cheerful, smiling women." "No, thank you," Jane replied. "After school, I'm going to study economics." "But do you know what the competition is?" Ellen would always argue at this point. "You either have to be 7 inches in the head, or you have to have a good deal of goodwill." "Yes," Mum sighed. "We can't afford commercial education. And you can't get in for free." But Jane, trying not to listen to the arguments of her sister and mother, strived for her goal. Day and night she sat over textbooks, looked for additional courses on the internet, mostly free, because her mother, who worked as a cashier in the local supermarket, had no money for her daughter's education, and her father almost did not participate in the children's lives. He had a new family. No, he still transferred some pennies of alimony, but everything was limited to that. No communication, no support or help in difficult situations. Jane knew from childhood that she could not count on him. The girl in her heart wanted at least once to meet and talk to her second parent. It seemed to her that, perhaps, the character she went just in it, because the mother in Helen Jane did not resemble at all. But he did not seek to meet his daughters. And Jane didn't want to impose. And it was scary to face indifference, or even worse, dislike of a native man. Dad was a businessman, owned a chain of shops, so sort of made good money. But all his property was prudently written down on the new wife, so that the ex-wife and children did not claim anything. It looked ugly, petty, even mean. In theory, Jane should have been as resentful of her father as her mother was, as Ellen was. But Jane had a dream to study to be an economist, to start her own business, and one day to meet her father on some business, a joint project, a profitable contract, something like that. Let him see what his daughter had achieved on her own, without his help. And then maybe they could talk as equals. And Jane achieved her goal. She got into the budget, to the same economics faculty, where she was so eager to go. How happy she was when she saw herself on the list of enrolled. She was screaming right in front of the computer monitor, jumping from happiness to the ceiling. "You're crazy," Ellen said as she looked into the room with little Andrew in her arms. She had recently become a mother and had a son with a rich man. He paid child support, but he was reluctant to communicate with his mother and Andrew himself. Needless to say, these alimony were pennies, a standard scheme, gray earnings, most of the income is hidden. Ellen still repeated the fate of her mother, even in an even worse version. But she was not going to give up and continued to dream of a prince who will definitely sooner or later solve all her financial problems. Her mother supported her eldest daughter in everything, adored her grandson. It was not surprising. Jane was also happy to take care of the baby when she had time. But the girl did not understand how it was possible not to draw conclusions from what had happened. Was it not clear? The plan is not very good and often fails. It was time to choose another option. But no, Ellen was still looking for rich men on dating sites. I got in. Jane explained her strange behavior to her sister. "Wow. Cool. So what, you're leaving us for the big city now? You're going to go to school?" Jane and her family actually lived in a city too, but a very small one, far from the regional center. So gray 3-story houses, whole streets of old wooden barracks, a huge private sector. Not a village by documents, of course, but in fact it is a village. That's why Orchardville, the regional capital, where Jane's university was located, was called just town. Her mother, too, was happy to hear of her youngest daughter's admission. She had never hoped for such a thing. As it turned out, she thought. Let her dream, show off, and when she realizes that nothing has worked out, she will follow in her mother's footsteps to the supermarket for the cash register. But also will think, finally, over the words of more experienced relatives, realize it is necessary to look for a rich and reliable man. And here's how it all turned out. Jane got in. "Well done," the daughter hugged the younger mother. "I'll help you in any way I can. I'm sorry, I won't be able to send much money, but at least a little for housing and living expenses. Again, you need to dress nicely. There's a better chance of meeting a decent man in a big city." "Mum, there you go again," Jane smiled. She was touched by the fact that her mother supported and understood her, and even offered to help her. Jane knew it wasn't easy for her mother to get the money, but she was willing to help her daughter while she was a student. and that's priceless. Jane had a new life. She was given a room in the student dormitory, though not a separate one. The room had to be shared with 2 girls. But the roommates turned out to be very pleasant. Both studied at the Pedagogical Institute. Both, just like Jane herself, were focused on study and work. In general, the girls had a lot in common. With one of these neighbors, Kate, Jane even became friends. They stayed in touch even after they finished their studies and moved out to rented flats. Jane liked her studies. She was convinced in her first year that she had chosen the right direction. She found economics easy, lectures seemed interesting, and term papers and tests were incredibly easy. Jane even began to earn money. It turned out that people were willing to pay a lot of money by her standards, of course, for essays and projects. The girl had to work part-time and study a lot. She had no time at all for student parties, going to clubs and similar entertainments. And sometimes, of course, Jane wanted to go for a walk, to unwind. But she realized that every minute counted. Her time was too precious. Besides, there was no money. Her mother tried to top up her daughter's card with a small amount every month. Jane knew that it was a significant part of her mother's salary, and she was very grateful to her. It was not enough, very little. Still, it was the help from her mom that kept Jane afloat. Especially after the 3rd year, when suddenly something in the university clinic changed, and students were obliged to pay for the dormitory. And before it was possible to live in it for free. Jane saved money on literally everything. But she couldn't keep up. She knew that she was going to her goal, which means that sooner or later everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be as she dreamed. But on New Year's Eve, an event happened that made Jane reconsider her plans and turned her whole life upside down. It happened at that hectic time when before the New Year students try to pass all credits in time to start the winter session after the holiday without debts. Jane was just getting ready for a credit in economic history when she received a phone call from her sister. Helen's picture popped up on the screen. On it, the girl was smiling broadly and looked like a star. Jane knew at once that something was wrong. Ellen would not call her at the 3rd hour of the night. It was Jane who was awake, preparing for exams. And her sister herself at that time should be having her 7th dream. Mom's in trouble. Ellen's voice rang through the receiver. It seemed she was close to hysterics. Come over. What's wrong? Jane felt her limbs grow cold and her stomach felt empty for some reason. Anxiety gripped her heart with an icy hand. Was she alive? But it was impossible to get a coherent answer from Ellen. She was already sobbing and sobbing into the receiver, dropping only a few insignificant phrases. Mostly they were wails about how she was afraid and badly off, as if the trouble had happened in the evening, but Ellen was informed only now, just a couple of minutes ago, and she immediately dialed her sister. Of course, at that moment there was no question of any credits and exams. Jane took the first flight home in the morning. She was almost the only passenger at the bus station at such an early hour. Jane found her sister in a terrible state, her hair disheveled, her face swollen with tears. In her arms she held her youngest daughter, Lillian, a baby girl. Ellen was already a mother of many children. Her eldest son, Andrew, then 2 girls, yearlings, Chris and Lillian. None of the fathers were involved in the upbringing of the children. The princes, sons of wealthy parents, refused to raise offspring and basked in money. With Helene, they were just having fun, with nothing serious in mind. And she kept stepping on the same rake, getting pregnant on purpose in the hope of finding a happy, strong family. If something happens to me, how will I cope with them alone? Ellen looked at Jane with confused eyes, as if expecting her to offer a way out. But Jane was ready to hit her sister at that moment. She didn't know what was wrong with her mother, and she was only thinking about herself. How did it happen? She asked. They had a corporate party, Ellen said, rocking her daughter. They must have been drinking. They told me Mum was crossing the road in the wrong place. Jumped out in front of that bus. The driver couldn't do anything. He's in shock himself. He's kind of in hospital now, too. He had a heart attack right there on the spot while it was being sorted out. While they were sorting it out. I got a call late last night, and I called you straight away. So Mum's alive? Jane clarified. That was the most important thing to her. What hospital is she in? A hospital not far away. Jane jumped out of the house, hailed a taxi. She had to get there as soon as possible. She had to find out what was wrong with her loved one. At the hospital, Jane got the terrible news. Mum's gone. She'd only recently passed away. As Jane rushed to the clinic, it all happened in the ICU. The doctor then said that there was no chance of a good outcome, the injuries were too serious. And Jane would not have been able to say goodbye to her mother anyway. She was in a coma. And still the girl blamed herself for her carelessness, for not supporting her mother by the hand while she was still alive. Jane was signing some papers when she received a phone call from a sobbing Ellen. She had been informed by someone on the nursing staff, and now the older sister was in a state of near panic. It had been a difficult time. Arranging the funeral, trying to bring the sister who had to look after her babies no matter what, and the gradual realization of the terrible fact that the nearest and dearest person in the world was now gone. Just no, that's all. The father did not turn up at the funeral, although he could not have been unaware of what had happened. This man did not even call his daughters, did not try to understand whether they need his help. Probably thought they were adults. They were both over 18. So legally, the father was no longer their debtor. He paid child support until his daughters came of age, and there was nothing more to expect. It was then that Jane realized that she would not meet or communicate with this man, even when she reached the top of her career. He didn't need her and Ellen and Mum. Neither did they need him. There was no resentment. No, it's just that Jane suddenly realized her father was a complete stranger to her. They may look alike in some ways, but Dad is a stranger. He's just a stranger, and that says it all. Ellen, on the other hand, is her own person. She needs support. Ellen sobbed nonstop for days. Jane didn't stop her. Let her cry it out. It would make her feel better. While her sister dealt with her grief, Jane helped her with her nieces. The little ones made her smile even in such a dreadful situation. It was impossible to look indifferently at their funny games, to listen to their cute babbling. The nieces, like nothing else, showed Jane that life goes on. Jane could not stay with her sister for long. The winter session. Ellen had already recovered a little and even started monitoring dating sites again. Now she wanted a supportive adult around her even more. Her mum was gone. Jane's session, in spite of everything, passed with honors. That meant an increased scholarship, but the money wouldn't even be enough to rent a room for a month. The dormitory became paid because you still had to eat, dress, pay for travel. Jane tried to combine her studies and work in the cafeteria. It turned out to be impossible immediately. A lot of passes and debts were accumulated. As a result, the girl did not even get admission to the next session. Expulsion loomed ahead. Teachers took into account the previous merits of the girl and went to her satisfaction. But she still failed. The only way out was to transfer to the correspondence department. Only here's the catch: the budget places were all taken. The commercial option cost a fabulous amount of money for Jane. The rector suggested a way out. One day he called Jane to his office and offered her the only, in his opinion, suitable option. "I know your situation. You wouldn't wish it on your enemy," began the conversation with a man who always reminded Jane of Carlson as good-natured, full, and short. "Student, you are diligent and promising. I want to help such a person. That's why I'll close the session for you. No matter what. Let us draw red lines. And you take a year's leave of absence. I'll help you get a job for family reasons. Get the money for your studies. You can do it. You're a man of determination. And when you come back, I'll help you with all the details. How's that?" Jane thought about it. She didn't want to interrupt her studies. On the other hand, what other options did she have? The session is not passed, that's for sure. So she'd have to drop out. And where to go? Go home to her parents' flat? Her mother's new boyfriend is already living there. A young and kind of nice guy named George. Unlike the previous aluminum suitors, he's not a rich major. The guy works on a construction site, working from dawn to dusk, earning money. Seems to like Ellen a lot, and he's taken in her kids. Maybe they'll actually make a family. Jane's not really needed there right now. And she doesn't want to live with her sister. No, Jane loves her very much. She's the only person in the whole world who's family. But still, Jane's used to peace, solitude, freedom. And there's a family of many children. You can't do that there. And after all, I don't want to leave Chicago. It's a big city. It's beautiful, spacious, interesting. There are more prospects for work and study here. The urban settlement, where Jane's childhood was spent, was associated with rage and hopeless longing. No, she didn't want to go back there at all. I think I'll take you up on your offer." Jane smiled at the rector. "What a clever girl," asked the man. "You're good. Everything will work out for you. Just don't forget to save for your studies. Be sure to come back to the university in a year. We'll be waiting for you." "Deal?" "It's a deal. Thank you so much for the offer." That same night, Jane started looking for a job. She urgently needed money just to survive, to buy food, to pay for a roof over her head, the most effective motivation. It turned out that it was simply unrealistic for a girl with an incomplete university degree to find anything close to the desired profession. Jane was rejected everywhere. Employers did not even consider candidates without a diploma. The girl realized that she could show herself at the interview, but it did not even come to that. After a couple of days of fruitless searches, Jane realized that it was time to give up her dream of working as an economist, or rather to postpone it until better times. In the meantime, she had to find something. When the bar was lowered a bit, things got better. There were plenty of jobs for Jane: waitress, cleaner, saleswoman, but the wages were meager. No, it was enough to live on, especially if you saved money. But Jane had to save up for a year's study. With those salaries, it was impossible. Still, Jane needed a job badly. Immediately, she chose the path of a waitress in a bar in the city center. There were plenty of reasons for the job. Firstly, there was extra pay for night shifts. Secondly, tips were very helpful, sometimes even very generous. And thirdly, the last job gave Jane the opportunity to write term papers and tests to order. And an extra penny in the piggy bank, and brains are not idle. That's the upside. Jane even liked working in the bar. The team is friendly, the bosses are loyal. The crowd was decent. It was a rock bar whose owners cared about their reputation. The atmosphere was monitored. Undesirable elements were expelled with guards and not allowed back in. And another. Local band musicians, performers, and visiting guests gathered here every night. In short, live music, and it was beautiful. Jane enjoyed listening to the musicians perform, singing along, dancing. This was welcome in the bar. To work as on holiday. In the bar, Jane finally understood the meaning of this common phrase. Of course, with a waitress's salary, there was not much money. Jane was looking for another job in parallel, a higher paying one. But the girl knew, even when she had to quit, she would come here to visit, just to be in this amazingly warm atmosphere. The rock bar and new friends helped Jane through her grief. Of course, the longing for her mother did not go anywhere, but the girl was finally able to return to life and believe that there are still a lot of good things ahead. It was in the rock bar that Jane met Jasper. One day, the host introduced the guests to a new rock band which appeared just a couple of months ago. Jasper was the bass player. But not only that, it was he who owned the idea to create this band. He was the one who wrote the songs and the music. Modest, always kept in the shadows, but constantly observing the behavior of the band members, the reaction of the audience. Jasper was the main man in the team. Although on stage most of the attention was drawn to the lead singer, it was felt. It was noticeable from the first glance. For some reason, Jane immediately singled him out and reached for him. She didn't recognize herself. Jane realized that she was not in a position to fall in love and have affairs. She was focused on her career, on her studies, on getting back on track at university. She couldn't be distracted by that. And yet, Jasper didn't flirt with the waitresses, didn't talk to anyone first. He was serious, focused on his work. Maybe that's what attracted the girl. Jasper was a lot like herself. Jasper began to appear in the bar often, sometimes with a group to work with, sometimes just in the company of mates to relax. Of course, they soon got to know each other, but he still acted aloof, not overtly sympathetic. Sometimes, though, Jane caught his eye. But Jasper turned away immediately, talking to someone else. And Jane wanted him to pay attention to her, to compliment her, to show her signs of attention, as visitors often did. And then Jane would let him know that she was interested in him. Once there was a girl in Jasper's company. Representatives of the fair half of humanity had come with him before, but they were just friends, girlfriends of other members of the group. And this one was clearly something between them. They didn't kiss or hug, nothing like that. But sometimes they exchanged tender glances and smiled very warmly at each other. Once she put her head right on his shoulder, and Jasper, usually cold and even stern, stroked her hair in a natural and very gentle gesture, as if she were a kitten. A very unpleasant feeling came into Jane's breast from behind the gate. She recognized it immediately, of course. It was jealousy. With surprising meticulousness, Jane began to pick out her rival's faults. Too thin, not even pretty. That nose, long, liquid hair. Anyway, how can this madam compare to her, Jane? For the first time in her life, Jane seemed to feel smug about her appearance. Nature had endowed her, like Helene, with beauty. Jane had heard many compliments from others about her figure. Tall, slender, long-legged. Her friends generally advised her to try her hand at modeling. Only this job was not to Jane's liking at all. Well, she did not know how to show herself, even considered it humiliating. And now, despite such impressive external data, the rival became such a gray mouse. In general, there was nothing outstanding in Jasper's companion, not even something to catch his eye. Nevertheless, he clearly had very tender feelings for her. The presence of this girl made him happy. Jane watched Jasper closely and could tell this for sure he loved his companion. It was painful. Thanks to the girl that Jasper was so attracted to, Jane had made up her mind, decided to do something she'd never considered unacceptable before. Her shift was coming to an end, but as usual she stayed late to help a waitress friend serve tables on a Saturday night. There were a lot of customers, and Jane waited for an opportune moment. She'd even had a few drinks beforehand for courage, to make her feel more confident and relaxed. Jasper stood up and headed for the exit. Someone had called him. The music was blaring in the bar. Impossible to talk on the phone in this environment. Everyone was either outside on the porch of the bar or in the smoking room. Jasper chose the street. Jane followed him like a shadow now or never. The obnoxious girl who had been sitting next to Jasper all evening remained at the table. She chatted cheerfully with his mates. It was obvious that they had all known each other for a long time. They must be in a long and serious relationship. Still, Jane would try, or she'd regret later that she'd never even tried. Jasper stepped out onto the porch. He paced the area in front of the bar, patiently explaining something to someone. Jane watched him through the large window. Jasper wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. Apparently the conversation was serious or unpleasant. It didn't matter. Jane would still approach him as soon as. Jasper pressed the reset button and was about to go back to the bar, but at that moment Jane came out to meet him. Luckily, they were alone on the porch at that moment. "Hi," Jane smiled at him. Jane smiled at him. Jasper looked at her with interest. "We said hello," Jane nodded. "I need to talk to you." Jasper immediately tuned into the conversation. He showed that he was ready to listen. He could have dismissed her, or shown irritation or displeasure. But Jasper looked at her with his dark, intelligent eyes and waited. "I like you, and I've liked you for a long time," Jane decided to cut to the chase. "I'm magnetically attracted to you. It's never happened to me before. I don't know what to do about it." Jane lowered her eyes. There, she'd said it. What's next? Jasper was probably looking for words to reject her as politely as possible. He probably was. Jane suddenly felt unbearably ashamed of what she'd done. Why had she gone to him? How could she look him in the eye after all this? Jasper often came to the bar. And then Jane felt his hands on her shoulders. A gentle touch, as if she were some incredibly fragile vessel. Jane, her name came out of Jasper's lips and sounded like beautiful music to the girl. Jane, I couldn't even imagine such a thing. Jasper looked at her and smiled. He so rarely smiled after all. His eyes, the girl could see it clearly, shone with happiness. Sincere, real happiness. What's going on? Was he happy to hear her confession? Instead of words, Jasper kissed Jane. It made the girl dizzy. He had his arms around her. He held her, or rather even held her, because her legs were literally shaking from the kiss. Then he stroked her back and head and held her gently against him. "I've been watching you for a long time, too, and I'm drawn to you in the same way." "Then why?" Jane didn't understand. "I didn't even notice it once. I thought you didn't care." "I didn't mean to embarrass you," Jasper said. "You shouldn't. Anyway, I'm older. Older for you. I thought you were attracted to other guys, brutal, successful. With your looks, Anything's possible. You're beautiful. You're unreal. You even inspired my song. Didn't realize I'm an Olympic princess? Is that about me? Jane asked. No, she admitted. It's a very beautiful song. I love it. I didn't realize it came from you. Oh yeah, it's just, what about that girl who came with you? Are you two together? Together, Jasper grinned. Ever since my parents brought me a pink bow tied to a box from the maternity ward and told me Lassie was my sister. So she's your sister? Jane laughed. I thought she was. That's why I decided to have this conversation today. Sister and Sister, Jasper said, pulling Jane tighter against him and breathing in the scent of her hair. Passing through town. She's been married a long time, lives with her husband. Far away. She missed her wayward brother. Jane and Jasper started seeing each other. Turns out he'd been hitting on the pretty waitress all this time. Why didn't he make any moves on her? I was going to. But later, when he's a little more cash flush. He had a clear message: a girl shouldn't be a loser. So far, there was too much to do with the band, organizing gigs and so on. But the guys were already starting to earn money from their songs. The prospects were looking good. And strange as it may seem for a rock musician, Jasper was shy with girls. No, he had a lot of friends with whom he could chat and laugh together. But Jane evoked a very special feeling in him. And that made Jasper, who was used to performing in front of hundreds of people, timid. But Jane made the first step, shattering all of Jasper's doubts. And now they were together. Jasper suggested they move in together. They decided on Jane's flat. Convenient location, reasonable price, cozy room. So it was Jasper who moved in with her. But he immediately took upon himself to pay the rent and minor repairs, which every dwelling needs from time to time. And it also turned out that Jasper is an excellent cook. Jane's culinary talents paled in comparison to his skills. Jasper, as befits a creative man, created real masterpieces, whether in the recording studio or in the kitchen. He was gentle, sensitive, and attentive, fully immersed in his work, but not forgetting about his beloved. They talked a lot, often went for walks. Sometimes together they discussed the next song, spinning in Jasper's head and ready to be born. Sometimes Jane would suggest to her lover the right phrase or words. He happily grasped the idea, and then the girl felt proud of herself. How about it? She took part in the creation of a hit. Jane completely dissolved in her feelings and new sensations. Before meeting Jasper, she didn't know what it was love for a man. She hadn't had time for that before. First studying hard, then trying to survive. It turned out to be so pleasant to be near a man who embraces you, interested in your mood and well-being, looking at you with admiring eyes, as at some princess, and to melt from the touch of his warm, strong hands. Knowing that he, this tall man with black eyes, would do anything for you. Ellen didn't approve of her sister's choice. As always, you have your own measure of everything. He's poor, he doesn't even have his own flat. Again, no steady job, no business. He's a musician, he's got his own rock band. So what? Who needs them anyway? There's a lot of these one-day bands, you never know if they're going to be successful. I think you got the wrong guy. With your looks. You shouldn't say that. I have 3 children. Who needs me? So I'm content with what fate gives me, I don't complain. But you. Jane didn't expect her sister to understand, though. They were always too different. But Jane didn't need understanding. She was happy, she was loved. She had someone close and dear to her. Yes, he was going through a difficult time. But Jasper tried, went to his goal, worked hard, looked for the right contacts, planned something. Jane supported him in all his endeavors, and he appreciated her devotion. Many times he said that he was grateful to fate for such a gift for her. One day Jasper made a rather risky venture, invited a famous rock band to Chicago. It was planned that his band would perform as a warm-up act for the famous musicians. This event was to increase the popularity of Jasper's band. Well, and in general, the organization of such concerts is a way to make good money. But something went wrong. Not as many people came to the concert as planned. There was a big rock festival in a neighboring state. Jasper didn't take that into account. Or rather, he found out about the festival too late, when everything was already in full swing. In general, Jasper went into a big disadvantage: payment of musicians' fees, Hall rent and equipment, tickets for the rock band, promotional activities, all this was paid off only half of the money from ticket sales. The concert itself went great, but Jasper had huge debts that needed to be closed as soon as possible. But with what? It was hard for Jane to look at her lover. During this period, he looked confused, anxious. I wanted to help him in some way. How? Where did Jane get the money? Jasper took out a loan, but it was a drop in the ocean. His friends helped him, the situation improved, but the debt was still quite substantial. And then Jane offered to help. She had savings, money she'd put aside for her studies. Not much, of course, but still. In addition, the girl did what she was against for a long time, took out a consumer loan. These funds were quite enough to cover the debt. From where? Jasper was surprised when Jane handed him several wads of brand new, crisp notes. I just got paid back out of the blue, plus the insurance. Finally paid off my mobile phone bill, she lied. She knew if she told Jasper the truth, he'd never take the money from her. As it wasn't like it was the last, randomly coming in. Thank you, Jasper hugged Jane tightly. I'll pay you back. You'll see, we'll be famous soon, and I'll pay it all back. Jasper paid the debt and continued to develop the group. Jane slowly paid off the loan. It was no longer possible to save for her studies, and her salary had suddenly become much smaller. The bar had fallen on hard times. It was good that Jasper bought groceries and paid the rent of the flat. That is, he took the main part of the expenses on himself. Jasper's income came from a few corporate gigs and the occasional part-time job. Unsteady income, but still the stream never dried up. Jane didn't worry about the financial side of their relationship. She enjoyed Jasper's attention, bathed in his love and care, and generously gave him tenderness, love and support. Jane tried not to think about the future. But if she did not recover at the university this year, she would do it next year. It would be all right. She still had time. The main thing is that he, Jasper, is there for her. Jane hadn't realized she was capable of such feelings before. And then Jasper disappeared. No, he hadn't run away from Jane. Nothing terrible had happened to him. It started out as a business trip. Can you imagine? Jasper grabbed Jane's shoulder and even shook her a little. His eyes burned like two bright spotlights. I was invited to New York to write music for a band. They found me on the internet, they liked me, and now they're inviting me. Jane couldn't believe her ears. She knew the band Jasper was talking about. They were very popular musicians, touring all over the world, and they had noticed Jasper. They're offering him a collaboration. Unbelievable. I'm going to have to go away for a while, Jasper continued. Do you realize what that means? Jane nodded. She understood money, fame, dizzying opportunities for Jasper's growth and development as a musician, useful acquaintances and connections. Jasper would get things he'd never dreamed of. But it looks like they'll have to part ways indefinitely. After all, Jasper clearly said, I have to leave, not we. The packing began. Jasper had a lot of things to sort out. Firstly, he had to find a replacement. Someone had to play in his band for him temporarily while he was away. Secondly, Jasper had to organize his passport and visa. Thirdly, collecting the necessary things. In all the hustle and bustle, he seemed to have forgotten all about Jane. Jasper was too absorbed in the upcoming changes and prospects. The girl looked at him and realized that he would forget about her in another country, muffled by new impressions, excited by work and success. Perhaps Jasper would even find someone there. But Jasper had hugged her so tenderly in the evenings, so sincerely assured her that he would miss her. Time would fly by quickly. And then there's the video link. We'll be in touch with each other all the time. At least I'll finally earn a decent living, pay you back what I owe you. I know how much you need that money. Maybe we can even buy a flat. My band will get bigger. I'll gain invaluable experience. I'll know what to do and how to do it. It's going to be okay, Jasper said sincerely. Jane could see that he wasn't lying, wasn't deceiving. But something told her that everything would change as soon as her beloved was abroad. It was just that Jasper himself did not realize it yet. And that's how it turned out in the end. At first, Jasper called every day, as promised, and told her how he had settled down in his new place. Everything delighted him, and he was overwhelmed by the experience. And then he suddenly dropped off the radar. He just disappeared. He didn't call himself, and he didn't answer Jane's calls. The long ring-back tones ended steadily with the message that the caller was probably busy, so he couldn't answer. Jane was alarmed at first. She thought that something had happened to him, something terrible, irreparable. But soon she saw the band playing on the music channel. Jasper was with them. He looked different, older and more serious than usual. I mean, there was nothing wrong with him. It's just that he'd apparently decided to start a new life and cut all ties, including forgetting about her. And Jane? At first, the girl still hoped, waited for him to call, to explain everything. But Jasper was gone, completely out of her life. Jane made it a habit to watch the music channel every day. Every now and then she'd see Jasper. He was never the center of attention, but he was still caught in the camera lens sometimes. And quite often there was a girl next to him, the same one. Either a makeup artist or the band's costumer. Beautiful, colorful. Apparently there was something between her and Jasper, couldn't help but be. Jane was desperately jealous of Jasper, both of this girl and of the other potential women of her lover. She was hurt as she had ever been. And also hurt and scared. Scared of being alone again, without the support, the warmth of a loved one. An unpleasant mixture of feelings and emotions. And there were other problems, more pressing. Money. Jane was barely making ends meet. After all, she had a tiny salary and a loan. Eventually, the bar went bankrupt. The new owners bought it and turned it into a hookah lounge. Jane had to quit like all the other employees. Another blow. Jane had special memories and feelings about this place. And now the bar was gone a cozy bar where she could always enjoy live music, where there was a friendly, warm atmosphere. Jasper would understand, support her. Everything was easier and more pleasant with him in general. But he was hundreds of kilometers away from her and seemed to have forgotten all about her. Jasper had no idea how desperate she was. He never found out about the loan. He thought Jane had helped him out with the extra money she'd suddenly received. And of course he had no idea she'd been fired. And if he did, what would he care about her now? Jane had no time to go over her grievances and think about what it would be like if she was in desperate need of a job, and preferably a decent paying one. And that's why she was tirelessly perusing the adverts. She wanted to find something that would help her get out of the financial hole. Good, at least the owner of the flat agreed to wait with payment. But he's got a lot of patience too. Jane would be asked to leave in a heartbeat. The ad caught Jane's eye with the amount of money they were offering for her services. Not a bad figure. It could solve a lot of the girl's problems, but the job itself seemed too unfamiliar to her. A carer was needed for a little girl. It didn't seem to specify the diagnosis, but whoever had advertised it had made it clear that the child needed round-the-clock care and supervision, including taking medication by the hour, accompanying her to procedures, and so on. Jane reflected. She had experience in caring for babies. Thank you, Ellen, to her mentor. The girl even enjoyed fiddling with her nephews. She knew how to get along with small children, knew how to feed them, change them, keep them occupied. But here we were talking about a sick child, apparently seriously ill. Could she do it? At least it was worth a try. Jane called the number given, and a pleasant male voice answered. The man asked her a few questions: age, occupation, education, experience with small children. And she was invited for an interview. Jane was nervous the day before. She wanted the job. Jane needed it like air. It was a chance to get out of a financial hole, to stay afloat. Where else would you find a salary like that? That's why Jane was worried, anxious. What if she didn't get the job? What then to look for a place as a waitress again? To work for a pittance? The taxi brought Jane to a country cottage village, an elite neighborhood, tall, beautiful houses surrounded by fences. At the gate, the girl was met by a woman, an au pair. As Jane found out later, in fact, the person who did everything: cleaning, cooking, laundry. Because her employer, Kevin, was always too busy. Businessmen in general have very little free time. Kevin met the job applicants in the living room. He was a man in his 40s with intelligent, piercing blue eyes, perfectly styled hair with light gray. An athletic figure. Yes, this man obviously paid attention to health and appearance. Jane was even embarrassed at first. How to start a conversation with someone like that? She suddenly seemed insignificant next to him. "Good morning," Kevin smiled warmly. Jane's embarrassment vanished. The man's smile was open, and the kind Kevin seemed at once like a man of his own. "Hello," Jane smiled back. "I'm here to see you." "That's very good. I'll tell you straight away. I need a carer for my daughter, Melissa. She's in really bad shape right now. So it's not for everyone. She's being monitored by the paramedics. They're here every day. I could hire a nurse for Melissa, but how can I tell you this? There's a lot of pain in her life already, a lot of people in white coats. I wish there was someone else there for her. You know, a young girl like you. Cheerful, who knows a lot of songs and fairy tales, who can cheer up a child, inspire him, come up with some interesting activity, in general, to brighten up her leisure time." "Why? What's wrong with your girl?" Jane just couldn't help but ask the question. Kevin lowered his eyes. His face darkened in an instant, becoming anxious and tense. "Melissa, she's been tested everywhere. No one could figure anything out. It's like her body is destroying itself. There's no sign of autoimmune aggression. She's been getting tests all the time. They do, but she's fading, and nothing helps her." "Poor baby," Jane exclaimed. "The doctors are doing what they can. I have the means, as you can see, but they're not all powerful, unfortunately. Anyway, Melissa needs more than just a nanny. That's where we have Vivian, our favorite au pair. She'll feed her and give her medication on time, and we don't just need a carer either. Melissa has nurses to look after her and do all the necessary treatments. What Melissa needs is more like, a friend or something. Someone who can bring her positive emotions. The doctors say it's very important in her condition. And looking at you, I think you're just that young, beautiful, funny, and you have a kind look in your eye. You know how to empathize. That's good." Jane nodded. She was anxious to see the little girl. She needed positive emotions, and she would give them to her. Jane would cheer up a girl who had such a serious illness, brighten up the gray, everyday life of the little patient, find a way to make her life more pleasant. "If you're ready to get to work right now," Kevin continued, "let's start a trial period. Let's say 3 days, and then it's up to Melissa to decide. Of course, you'll be paid for your time anyway. Do you agree?" Yes, Jane nodded. "That's good," Kevin said happily. "Then Vivian will introduce you to Melissa. I've got to go, I've got things to do." As the door shut behind Kevin, Vivian, a middle-aged woman with a surprisingly soft and cozy look, turned to Jane with a question. "Have you ever interacted with little kids before? Do you know what little kids are like?" "I have nephews," Jane nodded. "That's good." Vivian shook her head. "Except our Melissa, she's an unusual child. You realize that yourself. I guess Melissa hardly ever gets out of bed. She gets tired quickly. It's hard to keep her interested in anything, but you have to. Melissa needs to be distracted from her pain, from her torment, and she needs to be walked at least an hour a day. That's what the doctors said. I get it." "Well, let's go and meet her now," Vivian said. Jane followed Vivian to the first floor and entered the nursery. It was the princess's spacious room. A huge window let in a lot of daylight. Along the walls were racks of expensive toys and books. Right in the center of the room was a mini playground. There was a slide, swings, and even a trampoline. A little further away was a ball pool, and closer to the door was a bed. What kind of bed was it? It was large, round, with a pink canopy. Jane looked around curiously. She had never seen a room like this before. Was it really all for one child? In the midst of this splendor, Jane did not immediately notice the little mistress of the room. She was lying in bed surrounded by large, soft toys. There was a soft cat, a fluffy white bear, a bright green crocodile with flowers all over its body, and a thin, pale 7-year-old girl, completely transparent and almost blending in with the white bedclothes because of her unhealthy skin color. Huge blue eyes, like her father's, looked at the entrance with curiosity. Melissa propped herself up on her elbows, though it cost her great effort, and turned to Vivian. "Who's that with you? The new rehab doctor?" The difficult word came off the little girl's lips easily and habitually, and it was somehow completely unnatural. "No, honey, this is your new friend. Her name is Jane. Are you going to play dolls together?" Melissa perked up a little. "Whatever you want to play." Jane smiled at her. The girl was both sympathetic and pitiful. "I really like to play with dolls." "That's good. Vivienne doesn't have time. And Daddy can't play at all," Melissa said. "Grown-ups have a lot to do," Jane shrugged. "That's why they can be boring sometimes." "Right," Melissa suggested. And the conspirators smiled. "Boring," Jane agreed. Melissa laughed softly. "Well, I can see you're going to be fine. You two have fun," Vivienne said. She looked really happy. "I'm going to go make dinner." "Oh, and Melissa, you remember the nurse is coming to see you today, right?" I remember. The girl frowned. "More IVs. But where can I go?" Sweet Vivienne kissed the girl on the top of her head and left the room. Jane was left alone with Melissa. "Shall we play?" With a smile, the girl turned to her ward. "You have so many beautiful toys here. I can't keep my eyes open." "Better read to me?" the girl asked. The short conversation seemed to have drained her of her energy. Melissa sank down on the pillows and pulled the blanket over her skinny body, even though the room was warm. "Good," Jane agreed. She was surprised at the weakness of this 7-year-old. They seemed energetic, like Andrew, Jane's eldest nephew, who was just the same age as Annie. But you can't get him to sit still for 5 minutes. He's always up to something, making things up. If the boy were in this room, he'd be jumping on a trampoline or going down a slide. Lassie calls him a perpetual motion machine, and so does Lillian. Chris and Chris are the same, even though they're younger. Melissa, on the other hand, poor thing, is lying on her back. "What do you want to read?" "Princesses. There's a book on the windowsill." Vivienne started to read to me. "But she never has time," she said. It was a heavy, beautiful book with bright pictures. But the story itself seemed silly, boring, predictable, and formulaic. She herself did not like such fairy tales in her childhood. "Let's make up our own story about these princesses," Jane suggested. Melissa's tired eyes flashed with interest. "How?" she asked. "Very simple. I start, you continue." Melissa was fascinated by the activity. She was inspired to invent adventures for the princess. She was riding in a racing car. The heroine was kidnapped by a dragon and then rescued by a prince. The girl's imagination was running wild, which seemed to surprise Melissa herself. Then Vivienne entered the room. Seeing that Jane and Melissa were getting along, she was pleased. The woman brought lunch: mashed soup, stewed vegetables. "I don't want any," Melissa said, wincing. "I don't want anything. I don't want any of this." Vivienne looked at Jane, clearly expecting her to help. "Let me feed you," Jane turned to the girl. "Each spoonful is another princess adventure. I'll make them up as I go along. Can you imagine how much I'll have to tell you? Which do you think will finish first, your food or my imagination?" It worked. The food ended faster than Jane's fantasy. But Melissa demanded more stories. Vivienne splayed her hands in surprise, smiled, and walked out. Soon a nurse entered the nursery. Melissa immediately darkened. She was almost asleep. Lunch and history had tired her out. But it was time for treatments. "IVs?" she asked the nurse hopelessly. She nodded sympathetically. "I'll do it quickly. Don't worry, it won't hurt. You'll sleep later, and we'll have tea." Vivienne pulled Jane's sleeve. "Aren't you needed here now?" The AU pair led Jane into the spacious kitchen. Smoky cups of coffee and a flavorful cake that looked like it had just come out of the oven were waiting on the table. "You and Melissa are getting along, I see." The woman smiled, looking warmly at Jane. "That's good. Melissa kicked her previous nanny out, but she's taken to you. I've already called Kevin and told him all about it. He's very pleased and excited. He said to keep you safe." "I'm glad too." Jane smiled. "Melissa is just too bad. My nephews are so noisy, so cheerful, and she's lying in bed, not even able to play, nothing to play with. It's scary. What did the doctors say? Are there any chances? No prognosis. Vivian shook her head. They can't even diagnose her. They just dismiss the symptoms, that's all. Melissa's going to be better after the drip. You can take her for a walk after her afternoon nap for a while. Vivian continued her story. Kevin, Melissa's father, I understand. Where's her mum? On a business trip. Does she have a demanding job too, so she can't babysit her daughter? Vivian sighed. I wish. Lassie, Melissa's mum, isn't alive. The birth was complicated. The doctors tried to save the baby and didn't realize the mother needed help. And Lassie wasn't complaining about anything, just worried about the baby. That's how it all worked out. The day after the birth, Lassie developed a high fever. Checkups, intensive care, one thing led to another. Her heart stopped. Poor thing had some kind of internal bleeding. It's a rare case. And then there was Melissa in the NICU because she was born prematurely. It was a tough time. It's a shame, I agreed. That's a shame. Let me tell you the whole story, Vivian said. It looks like you're going to be with us for a while, so you should know. Kevin grew up in a happy, full family. A loving mom and dad, caring, attentive grandparents. A room of his own. Trips to the seaside every summer, birthdays. Friends. Kevin had a happy childhood, no less happy youth. He graduated from high school with honors. Thanks in large part to parents who cared about their son's education. If they saw gaps, they immediately hired Kevin the best tutors. And the boy studied English in foreign camps. He had a holiday and got an education at once. Vouchers to such places were not cheap, and it was not easy to get them. But what can't you do for the sake of your favorite son, especially if he is so desirable and long-awaited? Kevin's parents were old enough, they had not been able to have a child for many years. The couple resigned themselves to such a fate. But then, when there was no hope left, life suddenly gave them a surprise, finally gave them an heir. Needless to say, since then, all the attention of his mother and father indiscriminately belonged to Kevin. He was never shy of his parents, despite the fact that they were much older than the parents of his classmates. But Kevin, on the contrary, was proud of his parents. His father was a well-known businessman in the city, and his mother was the head doctor of a regional hospital. They were known and respected by everyone. It never occurred to Kevin to be ashamed of his parents. Kevin grew up. His parents were rapidly aging, giving up. When the guy was in his third year of university, his father died. Stroke, intensive care, coma, and that was it. Kevin felt like an adult for the first time. After all, he, a student, had to get into the affairs of the company, which his parents left him by inheritance. Since he was a teenager, Kevin had been interested in his father's business. He knew a lot of things, even had the right to sign. Yet for the first time, he had entrusted most of the processes to the board manager, a longtime friend of his departed parent. Because Kevin needed to study and support his mother, who had given up a lot after the death of her spouse. 3 years passed. Kevin had just received his diploma, had just taken over his father's company, had just started to gain strength. And then there was another blow, Mum this time. The boy was left all alone. Kevin felt miserable and lonely in his parents' big house. It was good that Vivian, the au pair and almost a member of the family, was there. She had known Kevin as a baby and treated him as her son. The woman had no children of her own. She gave all her care to the young man who had lost both his parents one after the other. It's been hard on him, Vivian shook her head. He was just a boy, and here he was. It was his job that pulled him through. He had to make decisions, go places, hold meetings, sign contracts, that sort of thing. That's what saved him. It's been a while. Kevin turned from a young, inexperienced guy into an intelligent, purposeful man, a talented businessman. Vivienne was pleased to see her mentee. He had grown older, stronger, more self-confident. The au pair wished Kevin would find a good wife, marry her, and become a father. Then Vivian's heart would be at peace. Only he didn't have anyone special. Vivian said no. There were some girls hanging around Kevin. He was a prominent, wealthy bloke. They're always popular. Except that one of them didn't work out, and he didn't feel anything for the other. They weren't to his heart's content. And Vivian didn't trust them. It seemed like all they wanted from him was money. They made eyes at him. And then Lassie showed up. Kevin met Lassie literally on the street. She was in a hurry to get somewhere, as it turned out later, for a job interview at Kevin's firm. Lassie had recently been downsized. The factory where she had worked as an accountant for several years after college had suddenly closed. So Lassie was looking for a new position. Kevin went out for a walk to get some air. He even had a goal to buy donuts at the bakery around the corner. And then fate collided the two men, literally. Lassie jumped out of the corner too quickly and ran into the unsuspecting Kevin. It was like a romantic music video. The bag slipped off Lassie's shoulder, its contents scattering across the pavement. Kevin and Lassie rushed to pick it up. The girl apologized. Kevin assured her it was all right and admired the stranger's beautiful gray eyes. It was love at first sight. When the young people had sorted out the bag and the things that had fallen out of it, they rose synchronously and smiled at each other. Kevin, like a man, made the first move. He learnt the name of the beautiful stranger and then introduced himself. They walked leisurely and talked, getting to know each other. When Kevin found out that Lassie was rushing to his office, he realized that this beautiful girl was his destiny. And it was no accident that they met in such an interesting way, rather than seeing each other for the first time in the office. It was more romantic, more interesting, more pleasant. In short, it was a real romance. Vivian had never seen Kevin so happy. Lassie turned out to be intelligent, understanding, kind. She quickly found a rapport with Vivian, too, which was important. Sweet, sweet girl. And for what? And just such a fate. Vivian shook her head sadly. A couple of years after they met, Kevin and Lassie got married. It was a wonderful couple, harmonious and happy. There was love, understanding, and respect between the couple. Vivian rejoiced when she saw them together, her beloved Kevin and his wonderful, beautiful wife. They decided not to rush into having children. Vivian continued. It was their common decision. It was like they felt something. They traveled, worked, met friends. And I, the fool, was advising them in my senile way not to delay it. I wanted to babysit their baby. But Kevin and Lassie lived on their own for 5 years after they got married. Were they happy together? No, they wanted kids, but not right away, later, until they were happy. And then the news of Lassie's pregnancy. It was an unplanned event, but the whole household welcomed it. Well, it's about time, Lassie summarized. The baby decided he'd had enough of waiting. Thank God. Vivian shook her hands. I think you're going to have a boy. You look so pretty now, Lassie. Girls take beauty from their mothers when they're pregnant. But the AU pair was wrong. The ultrasound confirmed that Lassie was having a girl. A healthy, strong one. They showed me a picture of her. They take pictures of a baby in the womb nowadays. I looked at her, and she looked just like Lassie. That's how Melissa was born, just like her mom. Melissa. It was Lassie who chose the name for her daughter. Kevin and Vivian didn't mind. They both liked it very much. The pregnancy hadn't been easy. At first, Lassie was suffering from toxicosis, then it seemed to recede, but it was replaced by other problems: high blood pressure, edema. The child developed well, but the mother suffered, melting before her eyes, refusing to eat, lying down a lot. The usually energetic Lassie didn't even have the strength to go downstairs. Vivienne carried her food straight to her bedroom. The woman felt sorry for Lassie, helped her as much as she could, and assured her that things would not be easy after the birth of her daughter. Children are for women, Vivian sighed. Pregnancy had taken its toll on Lassie. That depends. Jane shrugged, remembering her sister. Her children had been relatively easy. Anyway, Lassie had gone into labor much earlier than expected. The threat of miscarriage had been diagnosed throughout the pregnancy, so fortunately the mother-to-be was in the hospital under the supervision of doctors at that moment. They tried to stop the process, but failed. Melissa was born premature, weak. She didn't scream. She wasn't put on Lassie's chest. She wasn't even shown to her. Things are different when it comes to newborns who need to stay in the womb for at least 3 more months. Melissa was immediately sent to the NICU. There was a fight for her life. And Lassie seemed fine at first. I mean, she was tired, of course, after giving birth. Well, she was worried about her daughter. She was worried sick. It's all understandable. understandable and natural, Vivian said. The doctors examined the woman in labor, found no abnormalities, and sent her to the ward. It was only later that serious symptoms appeared, but it was too late. Kevin and I were worried about the girl, Vivian said, almost crying. It was obvious that even now, 7 years later, it was hard for her to remember it. We thought the baby wouldn't survive. She was born too early. She was too weak. And then, when in the morning Kevin received a call from the hospital and was told that his wife had died of internal bleeding, he could not believe his ears. He thought it was Melissa. His mind refused to accept what he was hearing. But no, Melissa had pulled through. She was a stronger girl. But Lassie was gone. Kevin went gray, didn't sleep or eat for months. I thought he'd gone too. Vivian stopped talking. But he did. I had work to do, Melissa to pull. To be honest, he hadn't been very good to his daughter at first. Vivian blamed Lassie for what happened to her. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help it. She was just angry with her. Melissa was discharged home and a nanny was hired for her. Someone had to look after the baby. Vivian was too old for that. But she enjoyed playing with the girl. Melissa took her around the yard in her prom and talked to her a lot. And she was the only one who gave the newborn the love she needed. My father wasn't capable of that at the time. She's like a granddaughter to me, the au pair smiled. I took to her right away. But Kevin. He shunned the child for a long time, bought everything he needed for her, and sometimes went for a walk with her. But that was if Vivian made him. He never took the initiative. Then one day Melissa got sick, high fever. Nothing helped. She was vomiting, poor thing. It was the flu. A lot of people got it back then, and the little ones took it particularly badly, Vivian said. But anyway, Melissa was back in hospital again. The doctors had no prognosis. And that's when Kevin came to his senses, dropped everything. He sat by his daughter's bedside 24 hours a day, singing songs to her, telling her poems, rocking her in his arms. And it was as if Melissa felt her father's care. She was on the mend immediately. Their little girl was discharged, and Kevin became completely different with her, a real father, loving and caring. Life went on as usual. Kevin worked hard, but always found time to spend with his daughter. Melissa grew up, pleased her father and Vivian with her excellent health and rare intelligence. And everything seemed to be fine. Except that Vivian was worried that Kevin was all alone. It seemed to her that he would not be happy until he met a woman. Only now it was a very difficult task. For Kevin's chosen one, she had to love and accept Melissa. Otherwise, any union was out of the question. Well, God has heard my prayers, Vivian smiled. And Kevin had a beautiful Samantha. I can't take my eyes off her. Smart too. She's got a kid herself, a little girl a little younger than Melissa. It's a great family. Samantha got a job with Kevin, and it all started at some corporate event. It's pretty standard stuff. Samantha was good to Melissa. She often took her and her youngest daughter out to an amusement park or to the cinema. Melissa grew to love both Samantha and her little half-sister Annie. She was truly happy. Kevin and Samantha got married and started living together, and then Annie started having these symptoms. First dizziness, then nausea, weakness, no appetite. Examination in the best clinics, trips to doctors abroad, consultations of famous professors, all this did not give any result. Doctors could not make the correct diagnosis. The girl was melting before our eyes. The first year she was still fine. She was still on her feet. Vivian almost cried again. It was obvious that her heart was truly hurting for the little girl. After New Year's Eve, she was quite ill. And now I am so frightened for her. I don't know what kind of illness has attacked our little girl. Samantha and her daughter moved into her flat temporarily. Annie was in daycare, and it was too dangerous for Melissa to get infections from there. So Samantha and Kevin made that decision. And it comes from Samantha a lot. Every day almost, Vivian continued. She's a good girl. She brings Melissa fair gifts. She brings Annie some too when she's not sick. But when she went to the garden, it started. Sick day after sick day. So it turns out they have a wife with one child separately, the husband with the eldest daughter separately. Such a family. Well, where to go? That's the situation. It's a strange situation, Jane said. She was shocked by Kevin and Melissa's story. It's like a TV show. Well, that's just the way it is. The older woman waved her hands. Melissa, I see she's getting along with you, and that's good, she said. Everything will be nicer now. Days went by. Jane now lived in the room next to Annie's nursery, but the girl often asked Nanny to stay the night in her bedroom. Melissa had a very comfortable sofa there. Jane made herself a bed on it. They talked before bedtime, holding hands. Jane saw Melissa's problems. It was very important. The girl clearly lacked attention, even though there were many adults around her. Kevin was a very caring and anxious father, a pleasant man to be around. They often had conversations about Melissa. The man always listened attentively to Jane, did not interrupt or argue, asked the right questions. Jane also got to know Samantha. Vivian was right. Indeed, she was a very beautiful woman. Chiseled cheekbones, beautifully curved lips, the grace of a panther, a true queen. But when Samantha interacted with Melissa, when she adjusted Melissa's blanket, smiled and stroked her head, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was a hypocrite. It was evident in seemingly insignificant details as well. A cold glint in her eyes, a squeamish movement of her lips, something elusive and very unpleasant. One day Jane had a strange dream. The girl found herself in some room, ragged wallpaper, creaky floors. She sat on a stool by a dark window, through which nothing could be seen, and realized that she was asleep. She wanted to wake up, but for some reason she couldn't. And then Jane did not even realize where she had come from. Lassie appeared as if out of thin air. Jane recognized her because she had seen Melissa's mother in pictures. Lassie smiled sadly and looked at Jane with a warm and very soft gaze. "Watch her," she said in a quiet, illogical voice. "Watch out for Samantha. She's the trouble. She's dangerous." Lassie vanished into thin air. And Jane had so many questions she wanted to ask her. Watch her how? What? Was she dangerous? Jane woke up in a cold sweat. Or rather, as if Jane had flown into her body, fallen into it. It was a strange sensation. Lassie's words were still echoing in her head. No, Jane didn't believe in the supernatural. But the dream, which was little more than a dream, was more like a journey through time and worlds. The strange dream just wouldn't let go. The next day Samantha was gone, and Jane waited for her. She knew for sure this woman was involved in something bad. Samantha is somehow hurting this family and doesn't like Melissa. She doesn't sympathize with the girl, she just pretends to care. And how come the others don't notice this? Even the experienced, long-lived Vivienne. Samantha turned up the next day, as beautiful as ever, brightly colored, languid. First thing she did was go up to Annie's to say hello. Then she went down to the kitchen. "Melissa's thirsty," Samantha said, looking at Vivienne. "Let me make her some cocoa." "Come on," said the au pair, fussing. "No, I can manage. I feel like it. I want to do something for her." "You're so thoughtful." Jane was silent. She watched Samantha like Lassie had asked her to in the dream. Somehow it felt like this was the big moment. It was as if Lassie were there, telling her to be vigilant. Vivienne was tinkering with the test. Jane pretended to look out the window, but she was watching Samantha. And there she was, the woman deftly pulled a small vial from her sleeve, dripped a few drops into the milk, and immediately hid the bottle back. Only a couple of seconds, a few deft movements, but Jane saw everything. "The drink for the princess is ready." Samantha smiled. "Jane, hand me her favorite cup, please." Jane obeyed. She watched in silence as Samantha poured cocoa into Melissa's mug with a picture of Melissa's favorite cartoon characters, and realized Melissa shouldn't drink it. She shouldn't. She should act on it. Jane pretended to slip. She bumped into Samantha, who dropped the cup out of her hands, the mug falling and shattering. "Cocoa spilled on the floor?" "I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy." Jane fidgeted, grabbed a rag, started wiping up the puddle, picking up the shards. "It's okay. I'll do it again." Samantha's voice was filled with poorly concealed irritation. Jane couldn't do it a second time. It would arouse suspicion. So she had to accept the fact that Melissa would get the cocoa from her stepmother's hands. While Samantha and Vivienne were at Melissa's, Jane squeezed the rag she used to wipe the cocoa into an empty tomato paste jar. She was going to take the liquid to be analyzed today. She needed to know exactly what Samantha had put in the cocoa. Maybe it was just vitamins. Then there was no point in panicking. But something told her it wasn't. She had to wait 2 days for the test results. When Jane saw the statement, she was horrified. The drink contained poison, deadly, causing symptoms similar to those of Annie. So the girl's weakness was due to her stepmother systematically poisoning her, just like in a fairy tale. Jane didn't know who to turn to with her news. Vivian? What could she do? Kevin? He wouldn't believe her. What do we do? Samantha can't be allowed anywhere near the girl. She wants to send her to the afterlife, and she's almost succeeded in that endeavor. Still, Jane plucked up the courage to talk to Kevin. She told him everything about her terrible dream, about the cocoa, and about the examination. Jane was afraid that he would shout, start to kick her out, or accuse her of wanting to hurt his daughter. You know, Kevin said, looking at Jane, I'd probably fire you right away if you'd said that. It's very strange, agreed. But just yesterday I had an unusual dream too, lassie. And she asked me to trust you, just trust, nothing more. Why don't you just keep this to yourself for now and take some time off? I need to sort this out. Vera Antonovna will call you when you can go back to work. Jane spent those few days on pins and needles. She didn't know what was going on at Kevin's house, and she was very worried about Melissa, who had already grown fond of her. But Kevin had said to wait for the call, so she would wait. Vera Antonovna called. Jane, seeing her name on the screen, became anxious. What would they tell her now? How did it go? Come over, was all Vera Antonovna said. We have such a thing here. Come quickly. Melissa misses you. Very much. Jane didn't have to beg long. Half an hour later, she was at Kevin's house. The owner opened the door, still as calm and unruffled as ever. It was hard to guess from his appearance what had happened. I want to thank you, the man finally allowed himself to smile. You were right. Samantha, she really wanted to. I'm afraid to say it out loud. That bastard wanted to poison Melissa? Vera Antonovna shook her head. You'd have to think. And I trusted her so much. The story turned out to be banal and as old as the world. Samantha was not going to put up with a rival in the form of her wealthy husband's favorite daughter. She wanted her own daughter Annie to be the sole heir to Kevin's fortune. Well, herself first, of course. Samantha had once trained as a pharmacist, but she never worked a day in her profession, preferring to live off rich admirers. Nature has generously endowed her with beauty, so that the opportunities for such an existence the woman had. Received in college knowledge was enough to think of a way to send the hated stepdaughter to the other side of the world, a poison that's hard to find in blood and tissue unless you look for it. Samantha put the toxic substance in the food she cooked for Melissa, and the girl was weakening, slowly fading away. We were only a short distance away from the target. It's mind-boggling. It's unbelievable. Vera Antonovna could not calm down yet. Jane understood her. Indeed, Samantha's act was monstrous. How could she do such a thing to a defenseless child? Melissa trusted her, loved her. So Kevin installed surveillance cameras in the kitchen. It turns out Samantha was poisoning Melissa's food every time she ate it. Sometimes she cooked something for the girl herself, and sometimes she'd drip it from a vial into the food, probably prepared by the housekeeper. I used my own hands to take it to Melissa. The poisoned Vivian shook her head. Anyway, Samantha had been caught red-handed. She was under investigation. Annie was taken in by her father, a man who had wanted to have contact with the child for a long time, but he wasn't allowed to because he was too poor for it, too unworthy. Melissa, and everything will be fine, Vivian assured Vivian. It wasn't the child's fault that his mother wanted to do this. And Melissa, how is she? Jane asked. Melissa's fine. Came from somewhere behind her. Jane turned round and met Melissa's eyes. She was still very thin and pale, but she already had the strength to walk around the house. A real miracle. The doctor said she'll recover quickly now. Vivian smiled. Jane and Jasper walked slowly along the shelves of the children's shop. It was the girls' section, so they both felt as if they were in a realm of pink and purple dolls, cosmetics, soft toys. It was mind-boggling. When I was in San Francisco, a guy bought his nephew a voice-controlled robot. That's the stuff. Maybe Melissa would like something like that, Jasper suggested. She's a girl, Jane reminded him. And she definitely wants a doll, a cartoon character. We should try to find one. Maybe next birthday she won't want toys at all. Kids grow up so fast. It's amazing. We'll soon see for ourselves. Jasper put his hand on Jane's rounded belly. The baby responded immediately with a still weak but palpable push. A year ago, right after Melissa had been rescued from her evil stepmother, Jane had been in for another surprise. She continued to live next door to Melissa. She was quickly on the mend, mastered active games, asked to take her for walks all over Los Angeles. The girl was still very attached to Jane, and she still needed a job. And Jane had already got used to everyone to the girl Vivian. Even Kevin did not want to part with them. The adults had initially decided not to tell Melissa the truth about what had happened to her. Too terrible story. But the sensible girl managed to put two and two together, heard something, thought of something herself. It's just like in fairy tales, the girl shrugged her shoulders. The little girl was coming back to life. In September, she went to school with her peers, and Jane was finally able to return to the university, chose a correspondence course, because she had to not only study, but also work. However, her work was more like life in a family with relatives sweet, cheerful Melissa, kind, wise Vivian, always busy, but polite and attentive Kevin. With these people, Jane was cozy, warm, and comfortable. They accepted her and were very grateful to her for saving Melissa. It's scary to think what could have happened if it hadn't been for that terrible dream. They discussed this unusual event. First, Lassie had dreamt about Jane, then Kevin. Vivian was sure of it. Lassie had broken through time and space to save her little girl. Kevin only shook his head and didn't offer an opinion. And Jane? She didn't know what to think. Perhaps Samantha had aroused her suspicions right away. After all, she hadn't liked Melissa's stepmother at first sight. More likely, Jane ran the thoughts through her head. It was possible that they'd been transformed into unusual dreams. Except Kevin had dreamed about Lassie too and asked him to believe Jane. That afternoon, Jane left the house alone. Melissa was studying. Vivian was doing chores around the house. Jane had to drive to the university to drop off some papers at the dean's office. Suddenly, Jasper stepped towards her. Jane couldn't believe her eyes. The sight of him made the hair on her head stand on end. And him? He looked happy and confused, smiling, looking at Jane as if there were no one more important to him in the world. "I found you at last," he said, and he held her close to him. Jane understood nothing, but she did not resist. She snuggled against the man she loved, enjoyed his closeness, and tried not to think of Jasper's betrayal, of his sudden disappearance. The explanation turned out to be ridiculously simple. Jasper simply dropped his phone into the ocean during a boat trip. Naturally, the gadget disappeared irretrievably. Jane wasn't registered on social media, so he simply couldn't contact her. No way. Jasper wrote letters like the old days, letters and telegrams. But Jane had moved in with Kevin and was hardly ever home. So the letters piled up in the letterbox and then somehow disappeared. "I remember this moment," Jane said. "I came home one day and saw that the letterbox door was broken. Someone had opened the box and taken the letters for some reason. Maybe kids? Maybe a nosy neighbor. In short, you never heard from me, so you thought I'd forgotten about you. Started a new life," betrayed Jasper continued. "I couldn't just drop everything and leave. It was about my career and our future, our well-being. It was unbearable without you, without news of you. But I knew I would have to wait, and then I would be financially secure for many years to come. And then I could fly to you and explain everything. I didn't realize how much trouble you were in. I didn't know you had to take out a loan. I didn't know anything about you quitting your job. It's been so hard on you." That's it. Just an unfortunate coincidence. Jane was glad that her feelings and Jasper's were real, that there was no betrayal or deceit in her life. Just a misunderstanding that had finally been resolved. Jasper now had a contract with a well-known producer in the capital. He had everything he dreamed of: concerts, gigs, tours, opportunities to take his music to people who were ready to accept it. And money. Money, of course. Jasper had even managed to buy a flat for the two of them. It was in the middle of a renovation. Jasper and Jane were married. They were already expecting a child. Jane felt happy and loved. She didn't work for Kevin anymore. And a stronger, more mature Melissa didn't need a 24-hour nanny. But they were all still friends. And right now, Jane and Jasper were picking out a 9th birthday present for Melissa that might not have been. "Your son is your responsibility now," said the daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. If she only knew. Hospital corridor. An old man with greenish tiles looked into my eyes. From the daylight lamp, long children stretched out their thoughts. The ceiling echoed in their temples. Amanda fidgeted nervously with the bracelet on her arm. She walked back and forth along the corridor, adding the clatter of her heels to the sunset of the lamps. She sat down, trying to calm down, then jumped up again. The doors of the operating theater rustled and creaked lightly. A doctor stepped out of them. Amanda jumped up again, looking hopefully at the medic. "Doctor, please don't be silent." She folded her arms across her chest in a pleading gesture. "The chances are 50-50, the doctor finally said, tightening the mask on her chin. "That she'll get out of the pram." Amanda sobbed sorrowfully again. "You have to believe in the best." The doctor tried to cheer up the girl. He was still young, he would recover. And I wanted to believe in the best. Of course, Amanda was worried about her husband's health, but she was more concerned about the loss of the family's main income and the question of who would provide for them now. Edgar rode out of the corridor to meet his wife returning from work. Amanda was not in a good mood. Lately, it had become a constant state for her. She had to get up early, work, do household chores, and still care for her disabled husband. "How was your day?" Edgar asked, taking the bag from the girl. "Disgusting," Amanda said sharply, taking off her coat. Edgar left for the kitchen. He was quite brisk with the pram and could even boast some mobility, if it could be called that. The man moved the bag of groceries to the floor near the refrigerator and began to open the door. He could only put his purchases on the first shelf or the bottom of the door. Amanda snatched the bottle of milk she'd opened on the way out, slammed it down and closed it loosely. It wouldn't leak to the neighbors. "Why are you shouting?" Edgar looked at her. "Would someone wipe it up?" "You." Amanda felt irritated and developed from her husband's helpfulness. He realized his limited functionality, so he tried not to inconvenience his wife. At first, Edgar was even ashamed, but later he accepted his condition and stopped suffering from remorse. "Can you heat it up for yourself?" "I'm tired." Amanda pulled her hair back with her hands and went into her room. The couch creaked faintly. Bleck the cat rubbed against her leg, begging for a treat. Amanda sat relaxed, exhausted, lethargic, and powerless. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married the handsome extreme sportsman Edgar. Now he's deprived of his passion and his income. And she has to work for two, running all over town showing cheap flats to poor families. This was not how Amanda planned to spend her youth. Her husband had been in a wheelchair for 6 months. At first they lived on old savings, but those soon ran out. Amanda put off looking for a job until the last minute. She was scared, and her inner state was against it. By the age of 25, the girl had no experience. She worked part-time shooting for online clothing shops, blogging for a young stylist, although she had a good education in the hospitality industry. From the first days, real estate work seemed to Amanda to be useless, incomprehensible payment, running around, a lot of calls, the need to persuade someone to travel to the objects. What kept the girl in such an unloved place? Charming director and owner of the agency, Michael. He appeared there rarely, but every time it happened, in the office began a semblance of scenes from the film office romance. All the few female staff began to intensively put themselves in order to correct makeup, hairstyles, check manicures, and it was done by both very young girl students, working part-time in their spare time, and an elderly accountant, Cassandra. Amanda, too, fell under Michael's spell. And the more time passed, the wider the gap between her and Edgar grew. She stopped believing in the doctor's prognosis, and it was a thankless task to take a chance. But here he was, next to her, a living, handsome man, Michael. Though not hers yet. but it was only a matter of time. Such thoughts daily swarmed the girl's head. There was a constant struggle between duty, feelings, selfishness, and conscience. And that evening, selfishness and inner whims won. At some point, Amanda realized that she didn't care at all about the opinion of others, that she didn't want to support her invalid husband until his retirement and cross out her whole life with it. She too deserves happiness, deserves the joy of being a girl, not to pull a heavy burden on herself. The decision came instantly. It was strange that such a momentous turn was made on an ordinary sofa in an ordinary city flat on an ordinary March evening. "Are you going somewhere?" Edgar asked, watching his wife pack a pile of things into her bag. "Yes," Amanda nodded briefly. "We're going to your mum's." Edgar raised an eyebrow in surprise and grinned with the corner of his mouth. "What kind of nonsense is that? A daughter-in-law wants to go to her mother-in-law's house by herself. The daughter-in-law is tired of working for two." Amanda threw Edgar's trainers into the bag with a swift throw. The man fell silent, and Amanda just burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore, okay? I can't. I'm beautiful, I'm young, I want romance. I want a decent man by my side, I want care and affection, not to look after an invalid." "Amanda." "I'll get out of the wheelchair," Edgar interrupted her. "The doctors said there was a chance." "Maybe you won't. I'm sick of this." Amanda threw in her bag a couple more t-shirts and zipped it up with a precise motion. "Are you staying at your mum's? We need to live apart for at least a few months. 6 months." "I don't know." They were both silent. Amanda was dumbfounded. Edgar realized that he was being thrown away like an unnecessary thing. Really, what good is such a helpless and useless husband? "And aren't you afraid to hang close to the ground when you're lying on that mattress?" Mate Terrence shoved Edgar in the shoulder, barely landing. "Fear the wolf," the man grinned, laying the foam on the grass so that he could gather it up without getting tangled in the slings. Edgar and Terrence had been taking tourists on extreme tours to the mountains, the Alaska range, for 5 years. The guys had tried everything that could tickle the nerves and make the flesh shake. Rafting, jumping rope, quad biking, long-distance hiking, mountaineering. But Edgar's greatest passion was paragliding. He spent almost the whole summer in the mountains. He flew, tried, learnt, got bumps, wiped his knees on landing. Once he dislocated his elbow, caught his paraglider on a tree, and fell from a height of a couple of meters to the ground. The air of freedom and the glamour of the mountains beckoned the stubborn lad, who flew where others were afraid to go, and stayed under the clouds for so long that his fingers went numb from the cold. Edgar started riding tourists when he was already convinced of his own skill. So the guys worked. Terrence was the driver and organizer. Edgar was the coordinator and implementer of extreme entertainment. For 6 months they earned so much that the remaining 6 months could not work at all. But they didn't. They simply changed the style of traveling, and instead of paragliding, they went snowboarding and skiing with tourists. "Oh dear, finish that stuff you're doing. If you fall from that height, you won't pick up any bones." His mother Cassandra shook her head. But the boy liked to live like that. It was 100 times better than sitting in a stuffy office poking at buttons. Dangerous? So what? It's dangerous to sneeze in a public place these days. So what are we supposed to do? Not go out? Of course not. You've got a great education. Go to the bank, make a career. Mother wouldn't stop. Will the children go to the mountains too? No wife, no kids either. Mom, why are you bothering again? Edgar sighed tiredly. The parent was in her repertoire. Talking about the dangers of paragliding and the frivolity of the tourist business was a regular occurrence, even if it brought in decent money. Edgar met Amanda on a social network. He was bored on a winter evening. The guy scrolled through the newsfeed and came across the page of a pretty girl. Something about this brunette caught the young man's eye. Word by word, they went on a couple of dates. The girl was impressed by Edgar's boldness and passion. He took her on several trips, even offered to take her paragliding. But Amanda refused the altitude. Everything spun quickly, and in less than 6 months he proposed to her. Edgar was not embarrassed that the chosen one is spoiled, somewhat capricious, ambitious. But she always waited at home, cooked delicious salads and dishes, did not criticize his hobbies. At work, Edgar's wife did not kick out the wife. "Let her do what she likes," he said to his mother. "I earn enough for two. At least she's always beautiful and fresh." Amanda was more than happy with this arrangement. She was already dreaming of a full-service travel agency, of a house somewhere by the sea, of her own column in some fashion magazine. Life went on at its own pace. Edgar and his wife lived a year and a half. Her mother gave the young couple her two-room flat, and she bought a small house in the countryside outside the city on her savings and moved in, but on the condition that soon there would be grandchildren. Edgar guffawed. Amanda rolled her eyes. Children were not in her plans for the next 100 years. But it wasn't necessary to upset Cassandra to know that. Instead of children, Amanda suggested that her husband get a Spitz. Edgar didn't mind and promised that after the next tour they would go together to a breeder and choose a puppy. A happy Amanda stayed home in anticipation, and Edgar and Terence took the tourists to the mountains. Edgar had been warned by everyone that his fascination with flying would not end well, but fate had other plans. The return trip in the mountains fell on rainy weather. In late August, Terence drove the minibus with the group, carefully slowing down on the serpentine corners. Edgar was dozing in the front passenger seat, tired from the busy program and the early rise. It all happened in a split second when a dashing local jigger in his car sped out of the corner and into the oncoming traffic. Terence swerved to the side to avoid the collision. The minibus tipped on its side and slammed into a pole and a concrete barrier. Edgar was literally squeezed in half between the roof and the dashboard. The other passengers were crushed like peas, but fortunately no one else was seriously hurt. They were just abrasions, bruises, contusions, and a couple of broken fingers. Terence dislocated his arm and suffered a concussion. Breathless Edgar was pulled out by rescue personnel only 40 minutes later. In the mountains in the rain and traveling fast is not even possible for rescuers. He was taken to the nearest hospital, but there was no one there to perform the complicated operation. The man was rushed to the state capital. There he could be given at least a chance to get back on his feet. The operation was a success. Edgar recovered quickly, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. Without words, it was clear that extreme sports were over for good, extreme sports and his favorite job. The minibus was beyond recovery. The firm was ruined. It was left without transport and its chief instructor. Amanda howled wolf as she realized her beautiful, comfortable life was over. Her attitude towards her husband changed almost immediately. Whereas before she had seen him as a hero, a pillar, a leader, a risk-taker, now he was just a source of trouble. Edgar experienced the crisis of loss of mobility for a long time. He became depressed. 10 times a day he revisited photos from his trips, pulled the remains of his parachute out of his rucksack, stroked it, holding it in his hands, sighing, staring at one point. The atmosphere in the flat was heavy. The doctor prescribed Edgar a set of exercises that should have had an effect over time. But the man, disgusted by his helplessness, could not start doing them for a long time. Amanda avoided talking about the accident and didn't poke her husband's nose in his deficiency at first. But as the irritation and strain grew, she sometimes snapped. "Don't be discouraged, son. Believe in the best, and do not give up therapeutic gymnastics called to raise morale only Mother Cassandra." Terence, who had recovered, came to visit occasionally. But it was hard for him to talk about what he had lost. As time passed, the former paraglider gradually heeded the doctor's advice and began to exercise occasionally. Just as Amanda began to think about divorce. Amanda had a breakdown at work. It was a frosty morning in the village. Clusters of rowan berries, covered in hoarfrost like earrings, adorned a bald bush. A flock of sparrows hopped in it with a cheerful chirp. Frost covered the ground. Amanda opened the gate and rolled the pram down the narrow path to the porch. Cassandra popped out of the door wearing a down shawl. The two women pulled the pram into the hay. "How long are you visiting, Amanda?" the mother-in-law asked, shaking an invisible speck off her son's jacket. "Edgar, for a long time." "I'm going back to town. I have work to do," Amanda replied briefly. Before Cassandra could even open her mouth, her daughter-in-law hurriedly said goodbye, slammed the door shut, and took a taxi back to catch the train. The women stared at their son in confusion. Edgar was gloomier than a cloud. He had lost his favorite thing, his ability to walk, and now his personal life hung in the balance. A couple of days later, Amanda arrived again. The man was hopeful when he heard the clatter of the wicket outside the windows, but Edgar's joy was too soon. "I've always wanted a dog," Amanda put the carrier with Bill's cat on the floor without even saying hello. The frightened cat huddled in the far corner and mewed hoarsely in fear. Amanda left without even bothering to say goodbye. Edgar felt a little better. The clever animal quickly got used to his new surroundings. The cat often slept on his master's lap while Edgar sat by the window in his pram or outside, breathing fresh air. Sometimes Bleck would jump up and down to catch sparrows in the snow, or hunt for an invisible speck in the dry grass. Edgar loved to watch the pet. It calmed him and drove away his boredom and longing for adventure. 2 months passed. It was the end of March. During that time, Amanda never returned. At first, the man called and wrote to her himself. But as time went on, his wife stopped picking up the phone and answered one-wordedly on social media. Edgar realized that he had been cynically and utterly dispassionately disposed of. Cassandra's mother shook her head and often berated Amanda. Cassandra was especially concerned about the state of the flat her son had left behind. "Good girl," Cassandra lamented. "She left her husband on my neck. She lives in the city in someone else's mansion and doesn't give a damn. Edgar, get a divorce, I'm telling you. And everything will get better. Stop it." The man waved his mother away, but he believed in his own words less and less. Apathy and longing were eating Edgar. He was tormented by his own idleness, because he could not do most of the housework. Walks were rare. Pulling the pram down a couple of porch steps to the ground was hard. Once again, as Cassandra tried to do so, an elderly neighbor, Norman, peered over the fence at her. "Hey Cassandra, what are you going to do? Say you've got him in your arms," shouted the old man in righteous indignation simply. "Hello, Norman," said the woman. "Well, what else could it be? You'd better help than scratch your tongue. The gate is open." The neighbor ran nimbly, not at all senilely, to the pram and helped it down the steps and onto the path to the gate. At the same time, he asked both Edgar and his mother about what had happened. "It's a misfortune." "A misfortune," the man scratched the back of his head, pushing his knitted cap to the side. "And it's not clear whether he'll get up or not." "I'll get up," Edgar mumbled, feeling terribly embarrassed that the two older men had to deal with him. "I've got it." Norman threw up a finger. "I'll come back tomorrow and tell you how to adapt it for the pram. Then you, grandson," he said to Edgar, "can you get in and out? Better get back on your feet, though. Okay?" Edgar smiled a little and sighed. "Norman's not like my grandfather, God rest his soul. A lazy bum," Cassandra exclaimed. "All he knew how to do was stuff holes in socks." The company laughed involuntarily. The neighbor soon left, having inspected the porch beforehand, and Cassandra rolled the pram along the pavement to the shop. Amanda opened her laptop after work, sitting down on the soft couch. She didn't look away from a message from her husband with another question. Camila was interested in something else. Today, Michael, the director of the agency, had finally paid attention to her and invited her to coffee together at lunchtime. It was not for nothing that Camila wore short skirts and spent several hours every morning in front of the mirror. The determination with which Camila moved towards the goal of winning the director was worthy of applause. The girl went with the chief to a coffee shop and made it clear that she would not mind to continue communication in a more informal setting. Michael caught the hint, and at the end of lunch invited the pretty employee to dinner at a restaurant at the end of the week. Camila cheered. "His suit is definitely not from a local tailor," Camila mumbled under her breath as she looked at her boss's photos on social networking sites. "And a decent watch and cufflinks." Her eyes burned with admiration, but more for herself. A month had passed since Camila had put her husband in her mother-in-law's care, and during this time she realized that her life was, in general, not so bad. The work suddenly stopped stressing her. Cooking and cleaning turned into rare worries. There was enough money for herself, and still had time to shoot for clothing catalogs. Sometimes on the mental horizon slipped thoughts of divorce, but so far Camila canceled them. It was necessary to prepare the ground for a run-up, so as not to sit soft place in a puddle, As a calculatingly cunning woman, Camilla understood this, and therefore did not hurry. Though Edgar could have served Edgar at any moment. But she would think of something. Yes, and not much believed Camilla that kind attached to her Edgar first will go to such a step. The photos of the boss told Camilla what she wanted to know. Michael in his 35 years was the owner of a nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and clearly had a passion for business things, foreign tailoring. The girl leaned back contentedly on the back of the sofa, scrolling in her head options for outfits for a future date. Her sick husband and the fact that she was legally married did not slow Camilla down a bit. She didn't give a damn. X-Day came. Michael picked her up in his car. Since her work in the agency, Camilla tried not to spread much about her personal life. She'd taken off her ring right after she'd sent Edgar to the country. And therefore in the car already flirted with her boss, who was 10 years older than her. The girl achieved her goal. In the morning she woke up in the house of her lover. Michael brought her coffee and asked if the young lady does not want to go to the skating rink. A couple of days later, Camilla flirtatiously agreed. Everything went according to plan. She told Michael what he wanted to hear, and he was slipping into an affair with his co-worker. At work, they decided not to advertise their relationship, although it was difficult to hide something in a female team. Soon the whole office was talking about the fact that the manager had a young mistress. Camilla quietly laughed at the gossiping colleagues, but did not hurry to reveal the secret. Her goal was Michael, not to hurt the noses of her workmates. The first day of April was too warm. It was as if the sun had reached the clear sky and was now eager to make all the plants grow and bloom in one day. There were even some sleepy flies in the air, dazed by the sudden joy of plus 19 degrees. Norman scratched his stubbled chin and held his visor up, looking at the sun. "It's blooming, isn't it?" He nodded to Edgar. The man sat in his buggy on the porch path, keeping his neighbor company while he reworked the sides into a strong and smooth slope. On Edgar's lap, Black the cat stomped around. He was writhing in pain, digging his paws into his master's lap. "Now we'll put some paste on it, and you'll ride like a racer," the elderly neighbor said contentedly, wielding a hammer. "At least we can do it without breaking traffic laws," Edgar smiled. He'd been a little perked up lately. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the fact that Amanda had practically abandoned him. Either way, clarity had come. Besides, Edgar had figured out a way to brighten up his hated idleness. He decided to write a book about his journey to paraplegia. He found a blank notebook in his desk and began jotting down ideas. Edgar had never written any texts before, except for essays at school. However, his work was quite vigorous. It was the abundant reading in the winter evenings, as his mother had always favored books and had plenty of them at home. On those same winter evenings, he and his parents, sometimes with neighbors or alone in the kitchen, would read across from each other while drinking herbal tea. At such times, Edgar would forget that he was deprived of the ability to walk and become a little happier. Bleck stretched his striped back, jumped to the ground, and disappeared behind the fence on some feline business of his own. "It's done." Norman surveyed the job well done, and then turned to Edgar. "Come on, son, try it yourself." Edgar, helping himself with his hands, began to carefully roll the pram up the makeshift ramp. A few minutes later, he and his vehicle were already at the door to the house. "Well, that's good," praised his neighbor. "Grandpa, are you here?" Came from behind the fence. "Let's go to lunch. I boiled some brine soup." Edgar turned his head at that voice, which sounded like the crunch of thin ice on a puddle. A girl in a striped jumper was waving from behind the gate. Her blonde curls were poking out from under her beret, and her bright blue eyes were visible, even at a distance of several meters. "My granddaughter," Elizabeth. Norman nodded discreetly to Edgar. "She's in town for the weekend studying. I don't know who she's studying for," said the old man. "Come on, Grandpa, let's go. It's getting cold." The guest stomped her foot demandingly outside the gate. I'm coming. Why are you shouting?" The neighbor waved good-naturedly at her. "I'll go." "Edgar, say hello. I'll see you again. That beam under the roof is bad. It could use a change." Norman gathered the tools in a bag, waved to Edgar, and went out the gate to his granddaughter. The man thanked his neighbor for his hard work, and suddenly realized that he couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth, even though he hadn't even met her. April continued to bring warmth and wind. There were sparse gray-white piles of snow in the flower beds, and among them were sprouts of the first spring flowers sticking out of the ground. Edgar hadn't written to Amanda for a long time, but he was actively working on his book. The second notebook was already written. "Edgar, can you get to the shop by yourself? Are you out of salt?" Mother shouted from the kitchen. "I can't leave. The pies will burn and the soup will run away," Edgar said. The way to the grocery store was simple, a straight asphalt path about 250 meters long, with no steps and no potholes. "I can make it," Edgar said. He hastily put on his jacket, checked the change in his pocket, and rolled toward the gate. Glad that he could help at last, it was time to go for a walk. His mother looked at him from the window. The tires of the pram rustled quietly on the already dry asphalt. Edgar moved slowly, looking at the village. In the gray and dreary winter, it was depressing. But when the sun came out, the carved shutters and skates on the roof shone. In front of the yard's colored borders and future flower beds looked out. Quick sparrows were dragging grain from the chickens' feeders, chirping. Somewhere sheep barked. The noise pleased the heart, heralded the arrival of warmth to people and animals. Edgar got to the shop without any problems, bought salt and rolled back. Almost back to the house, he heard the pitiful, familiar meows from the roof of the neighbors. The man looked up. Bill was sitting on the roof. Edgar had seen from the window that the cat used to climb up there on scaffolding. The neighbors were repairing something in the attic, and the scaffolding had been up there most of the winter. But the repairs were over. The scaffolding was removed so as not to clutter up the flower bed in front of the windows. And the poor cat was trapped. There was no tree nearby, no lower roof, no suitable fence to climb down. Unhappy, Bill climbed into the attic to the neighbors, fell asleep there the night before, and in the morning they cleaned up the scaffolding. And now the frightened animals, seeing the owner, shrieked at the top of their voices that the poor man was stuck. "How are we going to film you now?" "That's the problem." Edgar looked questioningly at the pet. He tried knocking and calling the neighbors, but they weren't home. Apparently, Edgar's conscience prevented him from calling his mother. The feeling of helplessness and inferiority came again. The man looked at the pram with dislike. If it hadn't been for her, I'd have climbed over the fence in no time, used the tools I had on hand to get up on the roof, and lowered Bleak down to the ground," he thought. A familiar ringing voice snapped Edgar out of his musings. Norman's granddaughter, Elizabeth, was standing nearby, looking up at the roof. "Yes, I wonder how to get it." Edgar nodded cautiously. "Well, you don't have much to think about," Elizabeth said. "Well, we can't leave the mustache in the lurch." She put the bag of food in Edgar's lap, rolled up her sleeves, and climbed over the fence to the neighbors. The man only clapped his eyes in amazement. The vivacious girl aroused in him a feeling of real admiration. Elizabeth walked round the house and found an old 3-step ladder by the shed. She shook the find happily, showing Edgar that she had an idea. The ladder was low enough to climb onto the roof, but high enough to reach her hands over the edge and grab the cat's paw. The frightened Bill clawed at the girl's hand, meowed, and looked around with bulging eyes. When the animal was on the ground, Elizabeth handed it directly into the hands of its owner, through the hole between the bars of the fence. Then she carefully carried the ladder back to its place and climbed back over the fence, as deftly as she had done the first time. There was no sign of the sudden intrusion. "You made us do a lot of work." She knelt down in front of Edgar and patted the cat's fur affectionately. "Thank you. I don't know how I would have got it myself." Edgar handed the girl a bag of groceries. "My name is Elizabeth," by the way she introduced herself. Obviously not, or he would have waited for another kind-hearted passerby. "And I'm Edgar." The man smiled slightly. "It's a good thing it was you," he said to the passerby. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose. "Let's go with you. Why not? It's like we're old acquaintances." "I'm just embarrassed," Edgar said. "I must be about 10 years older than you." "We look the same age," Elizabeth said. "How about just being polite?" "That's right," Edgar agreed. He drove forward a little, and stopped at his gate. "Let me help you." Elizabeth reached for the handle to open the door so Edgar could drive through freely. She took a careless step and tripped over the curb ledge. The man's reaction was lightning fast. He lunged forward and picked Elizabeth up with his arms. "I'm clumsy." She deftly hid her embarrassment behind a laugh. "It happens to everyone. It's all right." Edgar played along. "Elizabeth, come and have tea with Grandpa Norman." "Of course we will." Grandpa said something about the roof. Elizabeth remembered and nodded. She waved goodbye and went on her way. Edgar, for some reason, was as excited as a child. He rolled the pram onto the porch, opened the door to the house, where a hungry Bill immediately ran out. It was only then that he realized what had happened a minute ago. For the first time since the accident, the man felt his legs weakly as he pitched forward. They echoed with a slight tingling in his knees. Amanda stretched out in bed, rays of sunlight falling through the window. The hands on the clock showed around 10. Michael wasn't around. He always left early. Apart from weekends, work was the most important lady in the real estate agency director's life. Amanda was in no hurry to get to work. She was already thinking of quitting in general. She was annoyed that Michael wasn't suggesting it. After all, in fact, they were already in a relationship, and he could also allocate some money for her. When colleagues called with questions about his readiness to show flats to buyers, Amanda always found excuses: illness, fatigue, busyness, urgent trip. "If he doesn't offer, then I have to quit," Amanda decided as she waited for the coffee machine to make coffee. She liked Michael's house much better than her husband's flat. It was quiet, spacious, and every little thing was taken care of by a robot Hoover. Dishes are washed by a machine, and everything else is automated to the max. It's also perfectly clean. Once a week, Michael had his house cleaned by a cleaning company. He couldn't stand dirt and piles of junk, and he preferred dry cleaning, where all the clothes were put on a hanger and returned perfectly ironed. Unlike Edgar, he was always on parade, not hanging around with tourists, looking after himself. It all appealed to Amanda. It was the way she'd always wanted to live. That was the level she aspired to. The first part of the plan had already been realized. She'd become the boss's mistress. The next part was to gradually accustom him to her in her personal space. Amanda was already looking ravenously at Michael's second car, calculating whether she needed a fur coat for the next season, and when it would be better to take a holiday. And then, when everything was already taken care of, she would quietly divorce Edgar. The girl's plans were Napoleonic. At work, they began to suspect a connection with the boss when Michael drove her a couple of times. Amanda did not answer the questions, but only joked, rolled her eyes. When it all came out, she wouldn't care. In the meantime, it would be better to keep the affair a secret, at least not to be jinxed. Amanda ate a leisurely breakfast, showered, put on makeup, hailed a taxi, and left the office in full parade. She was sure it would encourage Michael to do something more decisive, such as asking her to move in with him at last. "Greetings," Amanda said to the manager, raising an eyebrow in mild amazement. "Not for work anymore." She placed the application sheet in front of her. "So, are you going freelance or have you already found a better place?" the manager asked, putting the application in the folder. You could say that Amanda smiled enigmatically. She didn't bother with the detentions at her former job, hastily picked up her things from her desk, bade a dry farewell to her colleagues, and dashed out into the street. It was amazing the determination Amanda had awakened when the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man loomed, and how she dreaded being left in poverty with a disabled husband. Amanda drove home, dropped off her belongings from work. Then she called her friend Camilla, and they went shopping together. The enterprising girl decided that a new set of pretty lingerie would soften the news of her dismissal from Michael. In the evening, Amanda met her lover in parade at his home and informed him of her decision. "Quit." "But why? You didn't seem to be loaded with cases, and you were always paid on time." The man was not naively surprised. "Why, Michael?" Amanda coquettishly sat on his lap. "To spend more time with you. After all, a well-slept, beautiful, satisfied woman is better than a tired working bee, isn't she?" "Yeah. Well, what makes you think you were?" Michael was genuinely perplexed. "That's how I felt." Amanda didn't like her lover's reaction. An awkward silence ensued. The man was the first to break it. I wanted to talk to you about the May holidays too. I thought maybe we could go to the mountains, rent a remote cozy house. What do you think? The word mountains almost made Amanda cringe. She was fed up with the mountains in her life with Edgar, and therefore quickly catching her face, the girl with the most innocent voice began to dissuade Michael from his decision. Michael, it can still be cold in the mountains. I want to get warm already, you know. She slightly played with her eyebrows. Maybe we should spend a little more and fly to a place where it's already warm enough. Lying on the beach is better than kicking up mud in the woods, don't you think? We could do that, the man agreed and reached for his laptop to look for a suitable offer. Amanda realized she'd won. Edgar was looking forward to the tea party with the neighbors, as if it were some kind of important event. He was also very excited by the return of the weak sensitivity in his legs. Had the hope of flying again risen from the ashes? Or at least to walk with his feet on the grass? Edgar longed for the paraglider, the mountains of his active life. He had buried it all when he got into the pram. But now there was a glimpse of a chance in the darkness that not all was lost. Edgar found the doctor's appointment folder, studied the instructions for physical therapy, and began to slowly exercise. Cassandra even let out a quiet tear of joy as she watched her son exercise. She tried to support him in everything, but not to push or nag him. She realized what Edgar was going through physically and mentally, and so she lagged behind with questions about Amanda, about motivation, about the flat. Time will come on its own, everything will work out as it should, the woman sometimes said to herself in the evenings, tapping her knitting needles against each other. On a warm afternoon in mid-April, Norman and Elizabeth appeared on the doorstep of the house. The landlady invited them in, but the brisk grandfather waved them away, saying that first work, then tea and talk. So he surveyed the edge of the roof and set to work. Cassandra fussed at first, but then waved goodbye and went off to make dumplings. Edgar and Elizabeth set up on the front porch in case the good neighbor needed to fetch tools. "That's a great-grandfather you have, Elizabeth," Edgar whispered in the girl's ear. "I don't remember my grandfathers. I was a little boy when they were gone. I guess I was lucky." Elizabeth nodded and smiled as she looked at her relative who was hard at work with a hammer. "And yes, you're right, my grandfather is a good man. An example for the whole family in hard work and optimism." "I can see that," Edgar agreed. "Do you look like him?" Elizabeth tilted her head slyly and looked down at Edgar. She rested her hand on the wheel of the pram. "What is it?" She looked at the boy expectantly. Edgar was embarrassed for some reason. His heart was pounding like crazy. This simple and perky student caused in him a feeling similar to the first flight under the dome of a paraglider. "You're light, witty, and kind," Edgar said in one breath. Elizabeth felt as if she were experiencing all the words in turn, and then nodded affirmatively, nodded a little pictorially, gave Edgar a playful tap on the shoulder, and laughed. An hour later, vanilla and cherries wafted from the open kitchen window. Cassandra leaned out the door and called out to everyone. "Give up that roof, Norman. And you guys, come and eat your dumplings while they're hot." Edgar and Elizabeth were chatting on a bench near the porch and did not even hear the hostess' response at first. "You, Cassandra, should have your stomach full of people when you're in the middle of work," the elderly neighbor said, fiddling with his tools. "Grandfather, let's not go. It will get cold," Elizabeth said softly. She grabbed the handles of the pram with Edgar and boldly rolled it down the porch to the entrance. "Don't do that, will you?" "I'll do it myself," he protested. "Let me take care of you," Lisa giggled but didn't stop. When the two of them went to wash their hands in the back of the house, Cassandra stopped Norman, who was late for the young people, at the threshold and whispered, "There's a flower in bloom." "I can't see it," he mumbled good-naturedly. "Do you take me for an old fool?" The neighbors smiled understandingly. When the whole company was gathered round the table, the plates were already steaming, fresh with jam, homemade dumplings with garden cherries, strong tea and sour cream so thick that a spoon could stand in it. Under the table, Bill grumbled. The cat nosed on one lap or the other, begging for treats. In the end, Elizabeth quietly gave the mustached cat one dumpling. Bill instantly dragged his prey outside with a proud look. "Who is it that feeds the cat from the table?" Cassandra was outraged. "Cassandra, will you send them for a walk as punishment?" Grandpa Norman winked at his granddaughter. Elizabeth and Edgar looked at each other at the same time. "That's right," said the landlady. "The weather's nice, there's no need to sit around. Go and pick a bunch of flowers. The goose meadow has already appeared. There's a whole meadow behind the village by the pond, and there's a path for the pram, just enough for Edgar to get through." After the meal, Elizabeth and Edgar, sensing a trick, but not seeing it, were outside the gate of the house and moved leisurely along the path. "Can't you walk at all?" "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's inappropriate." "It's okay," Edgar answered very calmly. "The doctors say there's a chance, but I can't walk yet." At the same time, he remembered the tingling in his knees. He had recently started doing his own exercises, gymnastics, to restore sensation. "But sometimes apathy overcomes me and I want to give up and accept everything he shared with the girl. They say that human possibilities are limitless, and it's all about desire." Elizabeth looked at the son and then at Edgar. "I'm studying marketing, but I want to work with people, with the masses. I feel a calling, but I don't know in what way." "That's great," Edgar complimented her. "In time, you'll realize where you're going. And you'll get back on your feet in time. I know you will." Elizabeth smiled and discreetly touched the man's shoulder. Edgar felt the warmth of her hand even through the thick sweatshirt. It remained there, even when the hand itself was gone. They talked and talked about plans and dreams, about the shortcomings of the student dormitories and strict teachers, about the countryside and the city, about the joys of being and imaginary problems. For the first time in many months after the accident, Edgar felt alive. If his legs would have obeyed, he would have run, spreading his arms out to the sides and putting his face to the wind. The pram hit a rock, rattling lightly. When the wheel shuddered, Elizabeth stopped. "Does it hurt?" "No," he looked up at her, bewildered by the sudden joy. "I think I can feel my leg." Her eyes widened, and she squatted down beside him. She grasped her leg just above the knee and pressed lightly. The skin responded to Edgar with a barely perceptible but uncomfortable, dull pain, as if through a pillow. Barely, but it echoed. Edgar grabbed Elizabeth's hand. "I can feel her," he whispered. "I can feel her exactly." Elizabeth jumped up and laughed, then threw her arms around Edgar, a tear running down his cheek, either from joy or happiness, or maybe both. Amanda was dozing in her chair with her headphones on. Michael was sitting next to her, looking at something on his laptop. Clouds flashed in the window. The plane was carrying them home from their holiday. Amanda was pleased, and mostly with herself. She had persuaded her lover abroad to buy some expensive gifts. The arguments were persuasive. "I really need it, and it will be more expensive at our place anyway." Michael didn't argue, but somehow he didn't have the joy of gift-giving on his face. Although Amanda was diligently broadcasting to the entire shop, glowing defiantly and kissing the man on the cheek. Michael himself never started a conversation about moving, despite the fact that the girl did not work, but he occasionally hinted at the need to find a new source of income. Amanda sincerely did not understand these hints, although she pretended to be a fool. In the end, she moved her things to Michael's house and appeared in the flat only occasionally. As the couple rested after the morning flight and drank coffee on the balcony, Amanda glanced again at Michael's second car. "I was thinking that I could drive," she said. "Where to?" Michael looked at her questioningly, taking his eyes off the phone screen and his work correspondence. "Shopping, errands, fitness." Amanda began to curl her fingers. "You can't do much in heels, so in trainers or boots. It's more comfortable." Michael shrugged. "And it's easier than buying and registering a car. Why buy a car when you already have one?" Amanda nodded down at the blue foreign car. Michael followed her gaze, pressed his lips together, and after a pause said, "The car's not running. I'm waiting for a new engine. Then I was planning to repair it, sell it, and invest the money in a project. And by the way, you don't even have any driving experience. You can gain experience, Amanda said. You can always sell it. I liked her so much. I could be your sober driver after all. Amanda was an excellent bargainer. She'd learnt while studying to be a translator that it was easier to ask for something than to make the effort and strain herself. And awkwardness could always be smoothed over with a woman's tricks. So Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose irritably with his fingers. I don't drink, and even if I did, I could call a taxi. The car's not running, no one can drive it. When the right engine comes along, I'll order it. But until then, you'd better buy yourself a good pair of trainers, he said. The man stood up, took the mug with the rest of the coffee and went back to his room, signaling that the subject was closed. Amanda pouted resentfully. The recommendation seemed insulting to her, considering that pretty shoes and stiletto boots had helped her initially win her lover. She was not refused directly, but rather harshly. She remembered the patient, kind Edgar, who, though he couldn't give her a car, had never refused her other more modest gifts. A few days passed. Amanda decided to ignore Michael's refusal and try to talk about the car again later. She pretended to be a diligent housewife, cooked a nice dinner, bought some good wine. The evening passed in a cozy atmosphere. Until Michael suggested watching a new film that showed the serene life of a family with 2 children. The father was playing frisbee with his son. The mother was teaching her daughter to play the piano. A golden retriever snoozed on the mat. I always wanted a big family, 2, Michael said suddenly. A son and a daughter. I even started this business so that the children would have enough to live on and not need anything. Amanda, who was lying on his lap, was slightly shaken, but she did not show it. So there it was, the perfect image of a spouse for Michael, whom he would agree to provide for without question, an educated, working mom. No, she's not going to be that. Wasting her youth and beauty on children, when there are so many countries, so many cool leisure options and ways to improve yourself. I feel sick, Amanda said, jumping up and going into the kitchen. Suddenly, she had an amazing idea on how to get all the benefits of a lover without cheating on herself. She opened a bottle of mineral water, poured the falling liquid into a glass and drank contentedly. The plan was simple and ingenious. Elizabeth would only come to the village on weekends. For the rest of the time, she had to attend classes. Edgar missed the girl, but tried to keep himself busy in her absence. He was especially focused on writing his book and doing exercises to develop his legs. Elizabeth supported his zeal in both endeavors. In the first 2 weeks of exercise, Edgar was able to wiggle his toes. In another week, he was able to slightly tilt his foot and tense his lower leg. With each new accomplishment, it was as if the motivation and strength for life was returning. May came. Birds sang, tulips, bushes, greenery, and fresh leaves bloomed. Cassandra was digging in the flower bed. She loosened the soil, removed fallen branches from the birch tree where red, yellow, and white tulip buds leaned. Next to them, crocuses climbed out in a row, and at the very border, blue caps of muscari buds. Bill was hanging around. The cat galloped around with his tail between his legs, jumped on the brick walls, hunted for soldier beetles that flew out from under the slate. Edgar sat in the pram by the porch, his eyelids closed, basking in the sun. Suddenly, someone's hands were on his eyelids. "What's the matter?" He stretched out, more amused than annoyed. "Elizabeth, did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" There was a giggle, and then Cassandra's chuckles. "I'm sneaking around like a gorilla," and he's like, "What's the big deal?" Elizabeth indignantly started tickling Edgar's ribs. He laughed immediately, shaking off the remnants of slumber. Cassandra laughed as well, watching the children fool around. When the fun subsided, they went inside to eat cold okroshka and drink dried fruit compote. At the table, Edgar discreetly put his hand on Elizabeth's arm. When his mother was at the cooker, pouring the compote, Elizabeth looked at him embarrassed, but did not remove her hand. Instead, she stroked his little finger with her thumb. It was a strange embarrassment to her normally perky nature. Edgar himself felt like a teenager, as if he were back at the institute and timidly seeking first dates with pretty female classmates. Cassandra saw what was going on at the table out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she thought of something urgent to do outside, grabbed her head, and dashed out of the kitchen. "Elizabeth, I have to talk to you." Edgar began when he realized they were alone. The girl nodded and turned to face him, her whole body on the stool. About what? About what's going on between us. Edgar sighed and took her hand again. I like you a lot. I realize that we're not just friends anymore. You've become important to me, and you're helping me not to give up. I realize you don't want an invalid, but I'll tell you anyway, I'm married. Yeah, she dumped me like I wasn't worth having around, but officially, I'm still married. Instead of answering, Elizabeth moved closer and hugged him tightly around the neck. Of course I need you for anything, and I'm sure you'll be out of that damn chair very, very soon, she whispered in his ear. Edgar's insides warmed. He hugged Elizabeth back, at the same time feeling the distinct tingling in his knees again as he pulled her to him. You are an amazing person, with a good heart and a beautiful dream. Elizabeth looked into his eyes. And I care first and foremost about how you feel, not what the papers say. The man smiled and hugged the girl again. Let's get you back on your feet already. Elizabeth kissed him on the cheek. Everything will work itself out from here. Amanda scrambled out of her seat and ran desperately to the lavatory. Under Michael's surprised gaze, they had just sat down to breakfast Saturday morning. They planned to drive to a business meeting and go for a walk afterwards. Are you all right? Michael knocked excitedly on the bathroom door. Yeah, just dizzy all of a sudden with nausea, Amanda replied, carefully mimicking the appropriate sounds. She made some more noise with the cistern drain, the tap, splashed water on her face, and went out into the corridor. Michael looked at her with a mixture of joy and anticipation. Are you pregnant? He blurted out. Oh, I don't know. I'll take a test today, Amanda clutched her forehead. What's there to do? Michael picked her up and sat her on the living room couch, fanning her. It's pretty clear. You're sick of food and your face is all bloomy. And if that's the case, would you be glad? Amanda pulled on the most naively righteous expression she could muster. Are you kidding? Of course I am. Michael knelt down in front of her. I've wanted kids for so long. And I applied for a second degree. What are we going to do? Take it back? Amanda changed from righteousness to a broken expression. Why take it back? You're a correspondence student. I'll pay for your education so you can work when the baby grows up, Michael assured her. Yeah, that's how I went to work. Amanda mentally regained her footing, of course. Good. I'll go to the doctor tomorrow and find out everything. She sighed, hugging a jubilant Michael. How to fake a pregnancy until the belly appeared. Amanda had thought through the nausea, mood swings, dizziness and bouts of appetite. It wasn't a problem. A doctor she knew for a fee could write certificates and reports for the first time. But then Amanda was going to stage a miscarriage. The only problem was how to divorce Edgar discreetly, but stay in his flat. After all, the ambitious woman had plans to marry Michael, but he thought the flat belonged to Amanda. He never allowed her to move in. He wouldn't kick his baby mama out on the street, though, would he? There goes the puzzle, thought the cunning Amanda. The certificate was soon obtained. Michael was jubilant, developed a flurry of activity, and was already choosing a name for the future child. He immediately moved Amanda permanently to his place. In the evenings, he looked through prams and cots, endlessly discussed everything related to children. The girl nudged and herself tried to catch the moment to file for divorce. It remained to quietly finish the story with Edgar, so that it would be possible to marry Michael unhindered. There wasn't much time left, and every day counted. In the meantime, Amanda was taking full advantage of her position. She was capricious, demanded a personal masseur, demanded to order food at home, but at 3 o'clock in the morning asked to buy a ring or a handbag. Michael fulfilled all her requests without question, even made a separate bank card for Amanda. After all, the wishes of a mother and her child were a man's law, and no matter what, he liked Amanda, despite her temper. Are you sure? Elizabeth looked at Edgar very carefully. Maybe we should wait. I don't want anything to happen. Yes, I'm sure. Edgar leaned on the armrests of his chair as hard as he could. It was time to try it. They were both in the living room of the house, on the carpet. Elizabeth stood beside the pram and held out her arms to the man. Edgar began to carefully stand up. At first his legs obeyed him on his elbows, but somehow sluggishly with a third of the strength that was usual for a healthy man. His knees bent like weighted hinges that hadn't opened a door in a long time. "It's heavy," Edgar muttered. Elizabeth watched the boy eagerly. "It's harder than learning to walk as a child." He put one foot down on the floor first, felt the shaggy pile of the carpet as if through a pillow. Then he put the other foot down. He had to make up his mind and let go of the armrests of the pram. Doubt overwhelmed the mind. Edgar closed his eyes and remembered his first paragliding flight, an eagle around the clouds that hugged the slopes affectionately, overgrown with pines, fir trees. He shivered at the long-forgotten sensations. He felt Elizabeth's support and tried to take a step. His leg felt like a stranger's, stricken with a cramp, but nevertheless he moved slowly forward. A movement, a step through the force, another step. His back was remembering what it was like to be straight. Edgar looked at his legs, scarred from his many extreme activities, and it was as if he was reliving them all a second time, standing here on the soft carpet in his own home. The man managed to take a dozen feeble steps with Elizabeth's encouragement and, tired, sat back in his chair. "You're doing an incredible job," the girl hugged him. "Let's go to the doctor. Let them record your progress. Maybe he will give some recommendations to make the process go faster." "That's a good idea. But how do we get to the city and the hospital?" Edgar nodded sadly at the still-needed wheelchair. "Norman has a car. He can drive it," Elizabeth suggested. "No, he won't, will he?" Edgar waved his hands. "Norman has already done so much for me. I can't. My conscience won't allow it." "Oh, stop it," Elizabeth threw at him. "That grandfather doesn't understand anything. Yeah, he's old and clueless." Edgar was embarrassed. "But only if he agrees, don't insist." He grabbed the palm of Elizabeth's hand, who was about to go to the grandfather. The old Jigalanok drove measuredly over the bumps of the village road. Norman spun the steering wheel and talked about the years of dashing youth and work in the collective farm. Edgar sat in the back seat, holding a folder with his documents. The pram rode in the back in the boot. Elizabeth chortled in the front passenger seat as she listened to her grandfather's stories. It all happened simply, quickly, and completely easy. She asked for it, and they drove. At least Edgar had time to call the hospital and find out if the surgeon would see him today. "Well, my dear fellow, you know how to surprise me." The doctor raved about Edgar after the examination. "At this rate, in 6 months you will be able to run." "Really?" Elizabeth, who was also present in the room, couldn't resist asking. "Of course, this is the first time I've seen patients recover so quickly from such injuries. It's a miracle. Although in scientific circles they don't say so." The doctor pointed at Edgar's medical records, then at his legs. "Keep up the exercises. Work on regaining mobility in all parts of his legs. I recommend that you try walking with support." Edgar drove back almost elated. He was confident that very soon he would be able to walk again, but also to fly. It was in this mood that the man received a sudden phone call. "Edgar." Hi, Amanda's voice came through the receiver. "I won't be long. Can you talk?" "Hi. What's wrong?" A lump rose in his chest, and with it came the memories that had almost stopped bothering him. "I filed for divorce," Amanda informed him briefly. "I don't think I need to explain why or why not. You're a big, smart boy. You'll figure it out." "Yes, I will," he confirmed his ex-wife's words. "Good. I hope they do it quickly. I'll be out of the flat in a couple of weeks." Amanda hung up after that. Elizabeth heard the conversation, unlike Edgar. "It's for the best. Don't be upset," she turned to Edgar and whispered. "You said yourself that she was just a formality." "You're right," the man nodded. "Still, I loved this man once." The key word is once upon a time. Amanda tapped her fingers contentedly on the arm of the chair. Everything was going according to plan. Edgar had agreed to the divorce, even though he didn't have much of a choice. Michael adored her. The pregnancy legend was confirmed by a certificate. A personal bank card with enough money for every whim at any time of day. Awesome. What more could one want? Amanda felt like a queen, with everyone she'd used in her pursuit of the perfect life dancing in formation in front of her. So what do we have left? Staring pensively at the ceiling, she popped a cherry from the platter on the table. A car and an official marriage, she said to herself, spitting out the pit of the fruit. That's what we'll do tonight. In the evening, when Michael returned home, the first thing he did was to hug Amanda and stroke her belly. The girl was waiting for him. She fed her lover a delicious dinner, poured him wine, and gave him a massage. When Michael relaxed, Amanda went on the attack. Michael, I really want the baby to be born in a legal marriage. I grew up in a full family myself, and I think fatherlessness is unacceptable. I agree too, the man nodded. I wanted to discuss this issue too. Amanda stood waiting, like a hound waiting for the command to hunt down a bird for its master. Instead of answering, Michael reached into the pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a box, and placed it in Amanda's hands. I wanted to make it pretty, but since we're talking, why not? Michael pulled his lover to him, kissing her forehead. I agree. Amanda threw her arms around Michael, admiring the size of the stone in the ring. They decided to get married in 3 months. By the time of the wedding, Amanda had already planned to get rid of her ex-husband. After the ceremony and banquet, a week would pass and she would induce a miscarriage. The trap should slam shut in time and securely. I'll have to put on a few kilos for the good life, the girl smirked, mentally continuing to listen to Michael's musings about the wedding. Surprisingly, he was hardly interested in Amanda's personal life. Before she'd met him, she didn't even remember whether she'd told him about the divorce proceedings or not. Apparently, nonsense like an ex-husband was so insignificant to Michael that he preferred not to spend any time or attention on it. Amanda realized it was time to push harder. Michael, when my belly grows big, it will be hard for me to go to the hospital and to do things. She put her head on her lover's chest. Maybe you'll think about a car. And so I would take a couple of lessons with an instructor to refresh my knowledge in my head. What do you say? Of course, Amanda was lying. She didn't have anything to refresh her mind, because she'd got her license through a big acquaintance and obviously not for free. The young lady was not intimidated by the road, the police, or other drivers. The prestige of owning her own foreign car blinded her eyes. Maybe your words make sense? Michael wondered. He put his hands behind his head and wrinkled his forehead. Amanda held her breath and looked up from under her lashes. All right, he finally announced his decision. Only we're going to do things differently. I'll sell this car and buy you something more feminine, okay? Sure, thanks, honey. Amanda squealed in pleasure and started hugging Michael again, wondering if she should buy a new watch or bracelet in honor of such important events as marriage and the car. You should go into town and get that tramp stuff out of the flat. Cassandra put a plate of hot soup in front of her son. You've been divorced for a fortnight and you still haven't. Outside, the window smelled of lilacs. June was buzzing with young grass and summer rains. The sun was lavishing light on the land. Mum, I'm not quite confident enough to drive myself yet, Edgar replied, opening a jar of sour cream. Over the past month, the man had made noticeable progress in regaining his legs. He could get up and sit down with support, could walk slowly around the house with crutches, walked along the wall without support, and tried to keep his back straight. Could you ask Elizabeth? She goes into town every Monday anyway, if she could help you, the woman advised, sitting down across from him at the table. I don't feel comfortable. She's already here with me all the time, like a carer, Edgar mumbled. Cassandra put her hand on his palm. Son, this girl loves you. Unlike the city girls, you don't blow it. Such girls are worth their weight in gold. The boy looked at his mother in agreement. Edgar realized that everything had been clear between him and Elizabeth for a long time. So why did he hesitate and wait for something? Maybe the proverbial pram was still preventing him from stepping forward, even mentally. Many people have a bad first pancake, but that doesn't mean you can't try again. His mother walked round the table, stroked the back of his head, and went out into the room. Edgar ate his soup, then pulled out his phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. Hi, I was wondering if you'd go into town with me any day soon and check out the flat. The guy spoke, nervously twirling his spoon. For some reason, every interaction with Elizabeth gave him a pleasant shiver. Edgar was shy, Lost, everything fell out of his hands, words were confused. He couldn't remember anything like this with any of his girlfriends. Did it mean what his mother was implying? Edgar didn't know. But each time Edgar waited for Elizabeth to come home from school more and more, and the joy of seeing her was brighter and brighter. "Sure, let's go," the girl agreed. "Are you sure you can manage without the pram?" "I have to," Edgar assured her. "Good," Elizabeth's voice warmed. "Then be ready on Saturday." "I'm looking forward to it." Edgar pressed the button too soon, and he wanted to add kisses. But again, that childish embarrassment ruined it. How surprised he'd be to find Elizabeth feeling the same way, standing in the middle of the institute with a phone in her hand. "I skipped the lab so I could come with you," Elizabeth blurted out when they were already on the train. Edgar looked at her in surprise. He had decided for the first time not to take the wheelchair with him and to use only crutches. "Why?" Instead of answering, Elizabeth climbed under his arm and tucked her nose into his side so that Edgar could only see the top of her head. He smiled into the measured, sleepy emptiness of the carriage, closed his eyes, and hugged Elizabeth tighter. The flat Edgar hadn't been to in almost 6 months echoed with the familiar turn of the key and the smell. The man breathed it in, standing on the threshold as if hesitant to enter. The smell reminded him again of times of traveling and flying. His paraglider was in a case in the cupboard on the balcony, his equipment in a rucksack, trekking boots, a camera for taking pictures from a height, a helmet. Amanda's belongings were not in the flat. Contrary to Cassandra's fears, she had taken every last jar, and judging by the footprints in the bathroom, quite recently. She hadn't even bothered to clean up. Edgar and Elizabeth ordered a snack to be delivered and began to tidy up. The man tried to do everything himself, but occasionally he stopped and rested. Elizabeth quickly tidied up the bathroom, washed the dusty dishes, wiped down the cupboards, vacuumed the carpets, and wiped down the mirrors. "You're doing a great job." She praised Edgar as they sat down in the evening on the sofa in the living room with sandwiches and cups of tea. "The doctor was right. You're getting better." "I'm too well motivated," Edgar joked, glancing at Elizabeth. She was embarrassed and dropped the sausage in her lap. "I'm very grateful for everything you do for me." Edgar took a piece from his sandwich and transferred it to the girl's sandwich. "But I am very much attracted to the sky. I want to fly again and do what I love to do. I just don't know how." Edgar frowned. "Aren't you afraid of hurting your back again?" Elizabeth wrinkled her forehead too. She knew what had happened to Edgar's partner and their plane. "Honestly, I'd go through it all again." Edgar looked at her defiantly. "Why?" Elizabeth bowed her head, perplexed. "To meet you again." Edgar leaned down, quickly pulled the girl to him and kissed her. Amanda hurriedly paced across the bridge to the cafe for lunch with her friend. They had just toured a dozen bridal salons looking for a dress for her and her bridesmaids. It was the end of August. All wedding preparations were almost finished. A restaurant had been chosen, a photographer, a designer, and a host had been hired. The menu was determined and invitations to guests were sent out. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be pregnant while sipping cold juice from a tube?" Judy asked. "I am. But what can you do? You want a beautiful life." Amanda grinned. "You've got Michael, I'll give you that," she said dreamily. "Handsome, with money, established. He's got it all. Not like your former test pilot." "You don't say." Amanda nodded, pushing her plate away. "The man's in his 30s, and he's still in the mountains, doing crazy things. It's all right, they're divorced now. Forgotten like a terrible dream." Her friends laughed. "How far along are you?" Judy nodded at Amanda's belly and grinned. "I'm in my 5th month of eating like a madwoman, and I've already gained 3 kilos. How can I lose it all?" "It's okay, 1 more week and you'll have a tragic drama." Amanda grinned. "Where do you get the paperwork from Michael to believe?" Judy whispered. "Camila, my friend, does it for me for a small fee." Amanda replied in her tone of voice. "We should go to her today, by the way. Michael wants the results of the ultrasound. Paul wants to know the baby." She grinned again. "You're a brilliant woman, Amanda." She admired her friend. "I wouldn't dare do that. If you want to live, you have to be able to move." Amanda shrugged her shoulders. The girls paid for their lunch and said goodbye. Amanda got behind the wheel of a brand new red sedan, and John waited for a taxi. In her head, Amanda was already imagining the wedding ceremony, figuring out how her dress would fit, what angle would be best to take pictures from. She ordered an exclusive bouquet of terry pale lilac roses from the florists and anticipated her image with it in such dreams. The girl drove up to the clinic car park. After a small formalities, Amanda was already sitting in the office of gynecologist Camila. The nice conversation was interrupted by a phone call. "Sweetheart, where are you?" Michael answered the phone to greet her. "I'm at my doctor's office. When I get off, I'll pick up the results and go straight home." "Oh, great, I thought I'd make risotto. I asked if you could have it, because there's wine in the recipe," Michael asked worriedly. "Okay, I'll be sure to ask." Amanda jabbed her finger at the screen without looking and slipped her smartphone into her purse. "He's worried about my pregnancy." She wrinkled her nose and made an inverted comma in the air with her fingers. "Well, what about you?" Camila nodded at the memo for expectant mothers on the office wall. "You could really get pregnant. You're already at the right age. And you have a reliable man. As they say, they would have hired a nanny, and you have a child and a status. And you're not poor. What's wrong with that?" Amanda wrinkled her nose as if she'd taken a bite out of an unripe persimmon. "Are you kidding me? I'm already thinking, how do I lose weight? And if the belly button did grow, there'd be stretch marks, swelling, and a C-section. God forbid. Maybe someday, but definitely not now." "It's up to you, but I would not refuse such prospects," Camila grinned. "So what do you need?" "An ultrasound at 16 weeks. I'll look it up. Who I've had recently with the same dates." She sat down at the machine, then back at the computer, and began to look for suitable data. A couple of manipulations to change the date and last name. Soon the required documents were lying in front of Amanda. The girl gratefully slipped them into her bag and moved an envelope to Camila. "Have you decided what to wear to the wedding?" she asked. "Yes, I've looked at a couple of options," the doctor replied. "We were discussing your photos." General laughter resounded in the office. Amanda drove home in high spirits. She picked up the wedding glasses from the salon, packed them carefully in a box, and was pulling into the car park of Michael's house by 7 p.m. "That's odd. I thought he wanted to make risotto." Amanda turned up her nose, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. The house smelled ordinary instead of Italian. And it was too quiet, no sound of rattling pots, no clatter of knives from the kitchen. The girl went into the hall and saw Michael sitting in the armchair. "Did you decide to order food from the restaurant?" Amanda tried to joke. Michael looked at her glumly. "Give me the car keys." "Why?" Amanda raised an eyebrow in bewilderment. Michael sucked in air through his nose, exhaled. "You're going to give me the car keys, then you're going to go to the first floor. Gather all your things, call a taxi, and get the hell out of my life." His voice rumbled so loudly that it echoed in every corner of the house. Amanda squirmed cowardly, her eyes watering. She tried to open her mouth. "Michael, what's wrong?" The man stood up and roughly snatched the keys from her, his hands shaking. "And tell your doctor I'll make sure she's not allowed to practice medicine. Or better yet, sue her," Michael said coldly, looking her in the eye. Amanda collapsed onto the carpet between the chairs. Her ears rang in her ears as reality rained down on her unprotected skin, burning her with the pain of hot needles. Michael squatted down beside her, took her chin, and turned her to face him. "Were you trying to get a warm place for yourself at my expense? I had the wrong time and made the wrong call." "Yay. How embarrassing. It was so stupid to think of it," he said with a sneer. Amanda burst into tears of shame. But Michael didn't care anymore. She remembered that night like a blur. She stuffed her things into suitcases and bags in 15 minutes, not even trying to apologize, even though it was pointless. Offended Michael, the director of the real estate agency, made caustic jokes about her, and then he poured himself a glass of wine and drank in silence, watching her ex-lover Amanda frantically packing her belongings. Before he left, he took away all her expensive gifts, watches, jewelry, branded items. Amanda walked out of the gate with exactly the same set of things she'd come here with a few months ago. "So are you ready?" Elizabeth stood in front of Edgar and held his hands tightly. "Ready, my captain," the man mockingly put a hand to his helmeted head. The paraglider takeoff pad spread out before them, and beyond it thundered mountains of unbelievable beauty in the autumn landscape. The slopes were drenched in all the colors of the sun's palette, from ochre to purple. The bushes of wild buckthorn shone with beads of miniature berries. Black thorns did not argue with them with their purple cherry leaves. Gray-brown stones, as if old wise men, soothed the riot of autumn colors. It was the end of September. On the bald slope away from the site, the last emerald lizards basked and rare butterflies fluttered. "When you go to land, don't spread your legs too far apart. We'll know when it's time," said Terence, adjusting his harness. "Oh, come on. What's the holdup?" Thomas, the instructor who had once trained John, peered out from behind the passenger cradle. "He won't be flying himself until next season at the earliest. I'm in charge for now." All right, stay out of this." Terence held his palms up and moved away from the runway with Elizabeth. "Let's go down the incline and I'll pick you up," Thomas commanded John. "Let's go." John gripped the safety harness tighter and sped forward. Elizabeth gasped when the wind caught the glider and it began to rise upwards, swaying weakly. Terence put his palm to his forehead, shielding his eyes from the sun, and shouted approval. "All right, let's go," Elizabeth agreed. "Good. I'm worried about him anyway." She rubbed her fingers together nervously. "Come on," Terence patted her on the shoulder. "Thomas is the best of the best. He'll bring your husband back to Earth safe and sound." Elizabeth just looked up at the bright dome of the paraglider, which had already risen even higher. "Let's go to the lower ground." "They'll land there," Terence nodded to the gangway. "When will you fly?" she asked. "I'll wait until Edgar is fully recovered," Elizabeth replied. "He's the only one I trust. And it's so nice and amazing and beautiful here." She spread her arms and breathed in the still warm, clean air, but with a hint of autumn chill. Terence laughed. "You haven't been rafting with us or riding quad bikes in the mud. There you can feel all the charms of wild tourism." "I think that everything is still ahead of us," Elizabeth smiled back. "Of course, we will definitely take you with us if you want. First we'll get to work, and then we'll send one on tour with people," laughed the cheerful Terence again. No. I'm only going with my husband." Elizabeth shook her head. They walked to the lower ground, where they found a thermos of herbal tea and sandwiches in the tents. A lot had changed in Edgar and Elizabeth's lives over the past summer. They sold their flat in the city and bought a smaller place away from the center. And the remaining money was spent on a second-hand minibus in good condition. Terence did not have to be persuaded for a long time. He was happy to return to the company and to travel to the mountains again. He only demanded a good insurance policy in case of unforeseen circumstances. Elizabeth took over the information part of the company, dealing with advertising, answering the phone and keeping the documentation. Edgar was not yet able to fly as an instructor. He had not yet fully recovered from his injury. But he was happy to tell tourists about the coolest places to visit, gave a copy of his book with an autograph to the most curious. But the biggest change was in Elizabeth and Edgar's relationship. They were now officially married. There was no lavish wedding, no expensive gifts, no typical wedding dress. The newlyweds signed, sat with their loved ones, and drove off to the mountains that same evening. By the time of the wedding, Edgar was already walking with a cane and did not need crutches, much less a wheelchair. The doctors applauded him and called it nothing short of a miracle. "It's so good to be here again, and to have everything back to the way it was." Terence stretched noisily with a satisfied face. "Almost the same old," Elizabeth corrected him. "I'm sorry," generously. Terence made a conciliatory gesture with his hand. Suddenly Edgar's phone, which was still in Terence's pocket, caught the connection and played a familiar tune, announcing an incoming call. "No, it's not Edgar. He's flying." Terence deftly retrieved the device and put it to his ear, winking at Elizabeth, who was listening intently to the dialogue. "How does it fly?" "Just like that. He's recovered. So I think the question is irrelevant. He's already married and loves her very much." Terence put the phone back away. "Who was that?" Elizabeth asked curiously. There's a fallen star." Terence waved his hand vaguely in the direction. Suddenly he jumped up and shouted, they're flying. Catch it." Elizabeth jumped up after Terence. The two of them, assisted by Thomas, brought Edgar safely back to solid ground. He was unhooked from the cradle, and the man was sprawled on the grass, arms outstretched, looking up at the autumn blue sky with sparse clouds. "Alive?" Elizabeth asked with a laugh. "As alive as I've ever been," Edgar blurted out, putting his hands behind his head.